Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto inherited Bahamut's Dragon King powers? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The night the sky answered. The night was wet enough to blur the lamps of Konoha into smears of gold, and Naruto ran along the rooftops like a rumor. The scroll of seals thumped against his back with every bound, oilskin slapping damply against his jacket. He loved the sound. He loved the sound because it meant he'd done something big, something that mattered, something that would finally pull him out of the shadow everyone kept shoving him into. He cut across a narrow alley and heard his own breath, quick and eager. On the next roof a ramen sign swung and creaked, and he threw it a grin as if it were a friend cheering him on. Then he dropped to the dark woods at the village's edge where the ground gave way under pine needles and old roots, where he could breathe without the roofs listening. The clearing was a bowl full of rain. He unrolled the heavy scroll, fingers leaving little crescents of damp on the old paper, eyes skimming the dense calligraphy like it would suddenly start singing the answers. His grin faltered. The characters were tight, razor clean, the kind of writing that looks like it bites. Naruto pressed a hand to the margin anyway. Just one, he muttered. Learn one. Show Iruka-sensei, ace the test. Then ramen. Then, everything. A branch shifted above him. He didn't look up. He wanted this to be just the two of them, him and the impossible, and for a minute it was. Then the wind carried a familiar step, steady, patient. Iruka. Naruto's shoulders tensed. He turned and tried on his most convincing smile. It was crooked and showed a little too much hope. Iruka-sensei, he said, casual, like he hadn't stolen a forbidden treasure from the Hokage's tower. You found me. Iruka stood at the clearing's edge in the rain, his Hittite catching a smear of lamplight through the trees. An umbrella in one hand, the other empty. No weapons, no scolding yet. He looked tired, softer than the night. Of course I did. He stepped closer. Water traced lines down his jaw. Naruto. Why? Because he was invisible in the daylight. Because shouting always sounded like laughter when it came from him. Because if he learned something from this scroll, maybe Konoha would have to look. Because I have to pass, Naruto said. And his voice came out sharper than he intended. I'll put it back. One jutsu. That's all. Iruka's mouth twitched like he almost smiled. You always jump to the last page. Can you blame me? Naruto shrugged toward the scroll. The last page is where the cool stuff is. The wet hush of the trees folded around them. For a second, nothing hurt. Iruka crouched beside him, careful not to muddy the scroll. Okay, Iruka said, show me what you've learned. Naruto blinked. You're not going to yell. I will, later. Iruka's eyes flicked past Naruto the way a shinobi's eyes always read a room. The tiniest frown gathered between his brows, then smoothed out. Right now, I want to know what you learned. Naruto laughed, sudden and relieved. He jabbed a finger at a section labeled in dense, formal ink. This one, Shadow Clone. The real one, not the lame academy clone. Iruka's eyebrow rose. Ambitious. Since when do I do anything else? He formed the seal. It felt like reaching for a river with both hands and telling it a joke. Chakra moved. The clearing's rain doubled itself, the trees blurred, and then the world snapped back sharp. 10 Narutos exploded into existence, all drenched, all grinning at Iruka with the same bright hunger. They whooped and clapped each other on the backs, and one immediately slipped on the mud and face planted with a splash. The others cackled. Iruka just stared, then started to laugh, not the polite teacher laugh but something that unspooled from the chest, like relief dressed as joy. Okay, Iruka said, pushing wet hair back. Okay, Naruto. The umbrella was still in Iruka's hand. He angled it toward Naruto without thinking, shielding him and not himself. The second sound came then, clean and cutting. A blade leaving a sheath with purpose. A voice slid out of the trees like a snake. Touching. Mizuki stepped into the clearing with rain on his cheekbones and something hungrier than envy behind his smile. His flak jacket was too neat for this weather. In his left hand gleamed a Fuma shuriken, wide as a man's torso, edges fattened with something that hissed in the rain. Seals. In his right, a smaller coil of paper, wound tight around a kunai. Iruka was on his feet in a breath. The umbrella dropped. Mizuki. Don't. Mizuki. Me like I'm a problem in one of your quizzes. He flicked the kunai up and caught it again. Like the blade needed attention. Hand me the scroll, demon. Naruto's stomach dropped so fast his knees wanted to go with it. The clones stopped snickering. One by one they turned our faces toward the voice and lost their jokes. Iruka's body moved without his face changing. He stepped in front of Naruto, half crouched, the air between them suddenly iron. Naruto is my student. Mizuki barked a laugh. Student. You mean seal. You mean cage for a monster that almost ended our village. Should I say it, Iruka? Should I tell him what you all kept cozy? Stop. Iruka didn't shout. He said it like someone holding a brittle thing in their hands, the way you do when you're terrified of dropping it. Mizuki smiled wider and didn't stop. You, Naruto, Mizuki said. You're not a person who failed a test. You're a walking disaster the Hokage decided to leash. The nine tails is inside you. You think anyone will ever clap for you if they know? You think. Iruka moved first. Maybe he thought a tackle would change the shape of the night. Mizuki had already thrown. The Fuma shuriken spun in low, hungry circles. The seal paper on its blades crackled with a mean little lightning that smelled like copper and old altars. It didn't aim for Naruto. It aimed for the space he filled, the idea of him. It aimed for the teacher shielding him. Naruto didn't have time to think. His body leapt before he did. He crossed Iruka with his back and threw his arms wide the way you do when there's nothing you own except your own skin. Time lost its edges. He didn't see a dragon. He didn't see a god. He saw the sky lay itself down in a bowl of water and watch his face. Something old and mercilessly patient, like a mountain that had learned to fly, looked at him through a mirror of rain. It did not speak words. It asked a question the way a cliff asks if you're ready to jump. What will you keep? Naruto didn't think. He pushed the answer out through his ribs the way he'd thrown himself in front of Iruka. All of them. The world cracked and remade itself around that answer. Light erupted. Not heat. Not the biting orange of fire he'd known in winter or the belly-deep anger that made villagers cross the street. This light was clean. It wrote its own shadows. It hissed against the seal paper as if offended that someone had stuck a cheap trick on a blade and called it fate. The shuriken ate the light and the light ate the seals like it had been starving for exactly that taste. The metal screamed and spun off course, bit into a tree and stuck there like a sulking moon. Iruka didn't get pierced. He didn't even get cut where Naruto's back should have been destroyed. Instead the air itself went hard. Hexes, small and trembling like fish scales, flashed into being a breath above Naruto's skin. They were the color of hammered dawn. Ether scales. He didn't have a name for them. He had the feeling of air choosing him. Iruka's hand was on his shoulder without him realizing. Naruto. Izuki swore and threw the kunai wrapped in a tighter seal. The paper unfolded mid-flight, banding itself into a ring with teeth of script. It snapped toward Naruto's chest, hungry, smelling like wet iron and temple dust. Something in Naruto flared on instinct. The light narrowed. It wasn't a blast. It was a choice. He felt a rule settle over his heart, older than any board the Hokage had sat behind. Guard the small. The air obeyed. The rule spread out from him, found Iruka, found the boy who wasn't really small but who had always seemed like one when faced with rooms full of adults. The seal ing struck the space an inch away from Iruka and folded like bad manners. Naruto had a fraction of a second to feel the cost, a tremor in the hands, a hunger he could taste in his molars. Then Mizuki was moving again, trying to salvage the night with speed and cruelty. He grabbed for the Fuma, wrenching it out of the tree with a roar, and charged. Naruto stepped forward and the ground felt optional. His body understood angles his brain hadn't studied. He planted a foot and the next footfall found air. One clean step on nothing, a rebound the size of a heartbeat. Wing step. He didn't think the word. He just moved. He landed behind Mizuki and opened his hand. The light came as if surprised and pleased to be asked. It gathered into his palm not as flame at first but as a presence, cool as river. Water and then suddenly hot where he meant harm. He pressed that open hand to the seal-laced blade and it hissed, sputtered, then guttered out. The metal talked about breaking. Mizuki stared at him, expression turning inside out. What are you? It wasn't a taunt anymore. Naruto could feel how easy it would be to let the light become anger and let anger do the job. He didn't want that. He wanted this to end with Iruka still standing and himself not turning into the thing Mizuki wanted him to be. He grabbed Mizuki by the shoulder and drove a knee into his gut. The man folded, dropped to the mud, spat water and bile, and reached for something else woven into his flak jacket lining. Naruto didn't give him time. He stepped in, short and clean, and caught Mizuki by the wrist, folded the hand backward, and twisted until the tendons squealed. Mizuki yelled. Rain kept falling. Naruto breathed. Stay down, he said. A clap came from the tree line. It was polite. It wasn't for him. 3 figures slid out from between the trunks in garments too dark for Konoha and too plain for missing Nin. They moved like they were used to being the quietest people in any room. The one in front wore 7 SL.IM talismans across his chest like someone else might wear medals. He was not smiling. He watched. He had the calm of a book that had ended and been placed on a shelf exactly where it belonged. Test run confirms divine signature. The man said, voice precise. He spoke to the others, but his eyes weighed Naruto the way a scale weighs gold. Null deployment. Who? Iruka's question broke on a cough. Naruto could feel the way Iruka's hand had tightened on his sleeve. Teacher instincts. Fear. Not for himself. The woman on the left tossed a ring like Mizuki's but larger, a hoop of matte metal etc. Head with a geometry that made Naruto's eyes want to slide off it. It hit the ground and the wet earth hummed. The ring rose without a hand under it and widened, a mouth opening, words on its inner edge shivering. The leader raised a hand. Step away from the host, instructor, he said to Iruka. Our mandate is extraction and containment. We will not harm the village. Iruka's laugh came out raw. You mean you'll harm him somewhere else? Quote, language has weight, the man said, and if he was offended it didn't reach his face. We remove the divine before it devours the mortal. That is mercy. Move. Naruto's scales, the hexes. The light flickered. He could feel his body complaining now, a thin knife of hunger under each rib, a heat behind his eyes. But the rule that had laced itself across his heart, guard the small, was still there. Solid as the letters on a forehead protector. He stepped so he was between Iruka and the ring. If your mandate is mercy, he said, prove it. By obeying. The man gestured. The ring lunged like it had a spine. Naruto met it with light. The ring wasn't like Mizuki's hacks. This one wasn't trying to tear. It wanted to erase. When the light struck it, the ring drank. And the light fought not to be unmade. The leader's eyes sharpened. Pleasure, maybe, in the clean click of reality following rules. See, he said quietly, to his companions. He leaks law. The ring shoved. Naruto shoved back. He could feel how thin his choices were getting. If he poured more of whatever he'd poured before, he'd black out and wake up in a room without windows. If he didn't, they would take him anyway. And his mentor would have to watch. Naruto, Iruka said behind him, voice small for once. Listen to me. If you need to run, I'm not leaving you. I can move. You, I'm not leaving you. He felt the shape of a sound in his throat before he knew he was going to make it. It wasn't a shout. It was older. He let it out and the clearing flinched. The roar wasn't loud to his ears. It was clear. It ran down his spine, through the soles of his feet, through the ring studs and the weird geometry, through the rain that hadn't chosen sides. The 2 operatives flanking the leader faltered a step. And it wasn't fear so much as being reminded of gravity. Iruka's breath steadied like somebody had thumbed the panic off his ribcage. The leader, 7 talismans, catalog eyes, didn't stumble. He nodded like a blacksmith testing a new alloy. Ancestral resonance. He lifted 2 fingers. The ring locked, hardened, drank more light. The hexes on Naruto's chest cracked. Pain jabbed. He tasted iron and the faint salt of his own stubbornness. Naruto put a hand back without looking and found Iruka's sleeve. He felt the fabric, the fatigue worn into the seams. He was 12, and ridiculous and hungry, and he was not going to let a rule swallow his teacher in front of him. Fine, he said, to the ring, to the sky, to a canny stranger with neat talismans. Then we go up. He stepped and the air caught him. Wingstep is a generous name. It starts as a clumsy hop. His was a clumsy hop that cheated a law. He took 2 in a row and the ring surged, missing by the width of a heartbeat, carving a wet groove where he had stood. He grabbed Iruka's arm and hauled, momentum doing what his thin muscles couldn't. Iruka swore, found his feet midair, and then Naruto put them both back on a branch slick with rain. The operatives moved to pursue, and the leader lifted a palm, not in warning but in measure. He watched Naruto skid along bark and sodden moss, checked the ring's drift, recalculated. When he spoke, it was to the others. "Kojiro," the woman said, irritated. "We can take him now." So could Annette. The man, Kojiro, tilted his head up, rain-flattening hair that looked like it had never been young. "But we aren't here to teach the village to fear the sky. We are here to keep it." He turned that weighing gaze to Naruto. "We will come back," he said, and it wasn't a threat. It sounded like an appointment. "Your choices tonight were instructive." Naruto had a retort cranked and ready. He swallowed it. He clutched Iruka's sleeve and breathed, stomach gnawing at itself, knees starting to shake now that the ring had drifted back to its owner's hand like a trained dog. Iruka's hand patted his shoulder once, absent, comfort automatic even as his eyes stayed pinned to the stranger's. They stepped backward into the trees and weren't there anymore. The clearing resumed being a bowl full of rain. Naruto stood very still so he would not fall over. Then he leaned against the trunk and eased down until he was sitting, forearms on knees. The hexes on his skin faded slowly, one by one. When the last went dark, the absence made him shiver. Iruka sat beside him. For a while they just breathed together. It was the kind of quiet that made space for both of them to be wrong and still present. "I don't," Iruka began, then stopped. He tried again. That was not academy curriculum. Naruto laughed once and rubbed his chest, fingers searching for pain and finding only emptiness. "Nope. Does it hurt?" "Only when He didn't know the word. "Choose too hard." Iruka's mouth tugged up at one corner. "That sounds like you." "Do you?" Naruto glanced sideways. "Do you think I'm a demon?" Iruka closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at Naruto like he had Alwa. YS looked at him in the classroom on those stupid afternoons when nothing went right. Steady, irritated by injustice on Naruto's behalf, fawned underneath it like a calmly banked fire. "No," he said. "I think you're Naruto. I think you're the kind of idiot who jumps in front of weapons too big for him. I think I should yell at you for stealing the scroll and I will. Tomorrow." Naruto's laugh broke and turned into something else. He wiped at his face like the rain had gotten personal. Iruka reached up, undid the knot at the back of his head, and slid his Hitai-8 into his palm. He turned the metal over with his thumb, then held it out. "This doesn't fix everything," he said. "But I saw you. Promotions are supposed to be for rules followed. Tonight I think it should be for rules kept." Naruto stared at the leaf symbol. Scuffed and familiar. He didn't know how to be cool in this moment. He took it before his hands could shake. "I think it looks better on you anyway," Iruka added, and there was that teacher tone again. "Dry as a towel. You always wanted to be seen." Naruto tied it around his forehead. The metal was cold and heavy and perfect. He breathed like he could finally fill his lungs. They got up together. The scroll gleamed where the rain made the ink shine. Naruto rolled it carefully, palms lingering like closing a storybook that had tried to bite him. "Do we tell the Hokage?" he asked, voice small with the kind of small that doesn't want to be. "We return the scroll," Iruka said. "We tell him about Mizuki. And then, we tell him enough." "Enough." Iruka looked at the trees. At the space where the ring had hummed, at the place in the rain where a boy had stood on air because he refused to move aside. "Enough for him to watch. Not enough for someone to put you in a room." Naruto nodded. He didn't feel brave anymore. He felt young and tired and weirdly awake. They walked back under the trees and into the wet glow of Konoha with their shoulders brushing sometimes and not needing to apologize for it. The guards on the wall didn't look twice. The village wore its own weather and noticed less than it should. At the tower, the Hokage sat with his pipe unlit, as if then he thought there were enough smokescreen in the world without adding one. Lines ran deeper under his eyes than the last time Naruto had seen him, and the sight made Naruto's chest go hot in a gentler way than fire. Iruka spoke. He told the story without the ring or the light, with the right adjectives erasing the wrong nouns. Mizuki's arrest was easy. Chunin scrambled, ropes hissed, paperwork Romized itself grimly in the near future. The Hokage listened. He had a way of listening that left you both lighter and more exposed, like someone had opened a window in winter. And the scroll? Sarutobi asked. His voice was smoke without the smoke. Untouched, Iruka said, except for what he used to pass. Sarutobi's gaze slid to Naruto and softened. Shadow clone. Naruto tried not to preen. He failed. The old man's mouth almost smiled, then didn't. You've done a dangerous thing, the Hokage said, and somehow he managed to say it without making it sound like Naruto, personally, was the problem. You've also done a brave thing. Our work is to make sure one doesn't undo the other. Something in Naruto's stomach twisted. He had to clamp his teeth around a sentence that wanted to be cheap and angry. I'll do better, he said instead. I'll choose better. The Hokage's eyes quickened like someone had struck flint in them. That's an unusual verb for you, Naruto. Iruka cut in smoothly. I'm recommending he pass. Of course you are. Sarutobi leaned back. The chair creaked. He looked at Naruto for a long beat as if measuring a future against the room's dimensions. Go home, Naruto. Eat, sleep. Tomorrow, you will report to your team as a genin. Naruto held it together until the corridor. Then he slumped against the wall and let out a sound like a laugh that had lost its keys. Iruka put a hand on his head and ruffled the Hittite exactly once like he didn't want to make it a habit and couldn't help himself anyway. Ramen tomorrow. My treat. After you apologize to half the village. Half. You can start small. Quote. Naruto drifted out into the night on legs that weren't so much moving as convincing themselves they still knew how. Konoha looked different. The lamps had stopped smearing. The rain had become a thing that water did instead of a curtain he couldn't push through. He didn't trust the feeling. He wanted it anyway. He ended up where he always ended up when the village was too much and not enough. On a roof that pretended to be a tower if you squinted, eaves slick, wind playing in the flags. He sat with his legs dangling, palms flat on the tiles, and watched. The sky tried to decide if it wanted to keep being night. Sleep took him before dawn did. When the dream came, it wasn't a story. It was water holding a piece of sky so still it looked like a door. He stood at the edge of it and didn't see himself. He saw a width of cloud and a brightness that had learned patience over centuries. He felt the presence the way you feel a river through the soles of your feet. The question returned, gentle as thunder at a distance. What will you keep? Naruto swallowed. He wanted to say, my village, but it felt like he was borrowing a speech. He wanted to say, my friends. But that felt like a poster you hang in a classroom. He looked down at his hands, at the faint memory of hexes, at the redness left by rope and the sting where hunger wrote a little note in his muscles. Whoever is behind me, he said, and the sound didn't echo. It just sank. Whoever is smaller than the thing in front of us. Even when I'm one of the small. The water turned, just so, as if a giant had inclined his head the width of a hair. There will be a cost. Naruto's laugh was a scrape. There always is. He woke to the first honest gray leaking over the mountains, to the village ofs peeling themselves out of the dark one by one like seals from a scroll. He was cold, pleasantly so, like he had been washed and set out to dry. The hunger was still there. It felt like a dog tapping his ankle. Hey, feed me. He touched the edge of his new Hittite. The metal had warmed to his skin. Down below, a small figure paused at the corner where the street opened into the square. Hi, Nada Hyuga moved like someone under orders given by her own heart. She looked up with those impossible eyes and blinked when she found him perched on a ledge like a gargoyle with bed hair. He felt heat threaten his ears. She lifted a hand, a tiny wave, unsure if she had permission to know him in the daylight. He did something reckless and simple. He waved back, big and shameless. Her shoulders eased. She kept going. He watched her for a moment before he realized what else had happened. The night had left something at his heel. A black ring of metal sat in the gutter, clean of rust, etchings catching dawn. He hadn't heard it land. He didn't like that at all. He picked it up. It hummed without moving. He could feel the place where his light had pushed it, the faint scar in the geometry, a flaw only the user would notice. A small paper tag had been tucked into the inner curve, held there with ordinary tape of all things. He peeled it off and read neat, unpretentious handwriting. Kojira, Sable Choir. We prefer invitations to hunts. We prefer consent to force. We're not your enemy unless you try to be everyone's god. Eat something. You shake when you stop. Naruto stared at the note until he remembered to breathe. Then he snorted, because the idea of a polite stranger telling him to eat felt like a grandma snuck into an assassination squad. He folded the ring into his jacket pocket and left the edge of the roof. The tiles were slick, but his feet found their way. He had a hunger to murder. He had a village to report to. He had, absurdly, hope. Below him, Konoha stretched, imperfect and stubborn and home. The lamps went out one by one like winks. Somewhere near the market, a shopkeeper shouted about produce like the world hadn't tilted a degree overnight. Naruto stepped off the parapet. Just before his sandals met the wall, he let his foot fall a little slower than gravity wanted. The air held him for a fraction longer than it should have. He smiled. He didn't need that trick very often. He was going to use it anyway. Behind him, dawn finally decided to be day. The sky opened like a palm. Naruto set his shoulder against it and started walking. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. Bridge of Storms. The first lie Tazuna told was that it would be a quiet escort to Wave. He said it with a hangover in his voice and a paper-thin smile, smelling like a sake bottle had raised him. Kakashi stared with one eye and a paperback. Sakura clutched her mission pouch like it might walk away, and Sasuke looked at Tazuna the way a knife looks at rope. Naruto's stomach growled at the same time. His pocket hummed. The black metal ring he'd found that morning, Kojira's polite threat-turned souvenir, still carried a whisper like a tuning fork you forgot on a shelf. Why do bridge builders always look like they owe someone money? Naruto muttered. Because they do, Kakashi said without looking up from his dog-eared book. Ready. They took the south road. The rain didn't follow them, but the clouds did, congregating over the sea like an argument that had started inland and decided to continue elsewhere. Konoha thinned behind them into fields where scarecrows stood with arms out like they'd tried to stop a storm and failed. Naruto kept checking the ditch, the scrub, the wind. Not like a paranoid, like a person who had learned, fast, that some strangers didn't shout their names before throwing rings that ate rules. They reached the puddle. It gleamed in the road ahead, too clean for thirsty dirt. Naruto saw it and felt his skin tighten. The air had that off smell. Metal under rain, breath held. Sasuke's hand was already moving. Sakura's eyes flicked to Kakashi and back so quick it almost didn't happen. Kakashi kept reading. Naruto didn't shout. He took 2 steps forward and then another on the same bit of ground. And the puddle made a little sound like surprise as his sandal hit air for a fraction too long. The demon brothers burst out of the false water with chain and hooked claws. The first going for Kakashi, the second for Tazuna's throat. Naruto didn't think about talismans or sermons. He stuck his hand in the chain and burned it. Platinum light snapped out sideways like a glare that had patience. The chain didn't melt. The seals rubbed into the links just forgot how to be hungry. The brother attached to it swore and stumbled. Momentum made silly when the anchor turned into light. Sasuke was there for the other one, crisp as a diagram. His kick turned the claw aside. Steel bit bark instead of an old man's neck. Sakura got Tazuna moving behind Naruto's shoulder without waiting for an order. It should have been sloppy. It felt like they had practiced it for a year in someone else's life. The Kakashi's dead gambit lasted just long enough for the brothers to grin. They didn't get to finish. Kakashi dropped the genjutsu like a coat he'd never really worn, the book gone, the lazy gone with it. He pinned one attacker by the wrist, the other by the throat, and looked at Naruto as if to say, well. Naruto looked at the 2 men narrowing their eyes at his hand where light still pooled a little, like it didn't want to admit the party was over. He breathed and let it go. The light faded without drama, just the way a decision ends. Nice catch, Kakashi said, as if Naruto had snagged a ball. Naruto tried not to glow. He failed, a little. Thanks. Kakashi's attention flicked to the brothers again, to the chain with its singed, harmless seals. You were hired to kill Tazuna, he said. You knew we were shinobi. You attacked anyway. Gato pays. The man with his throat pinned grinned. Brand new hate in it, and spat mud. He pays to make it quiet. I'm not a fan of quiet, Naruto said. He heard Tazuna's breath stutter and steadied his own without thinking about it. It hides things. Quote, Kakashi's sound wasn't agreement or disagreement, it was a little nail holding the moment steady. Tazuna's mouth thinned. He avoided Naruto's eyes like the sight of a boy with light in his hand might add weight to the truth. I didn't lie. He tried, which was a lie that only old men try when they're tired. I just didn't make it noisy. Tell us now, Kakashi said. No softness. Everything. Tazuna told them about Wave, about Gato buying officials and selling fear, about a bridge rising out of water with no permission but the permis. Scion a community gives itself when it refuses to drown. He talked about being too small, with a bitter pride, like wearing a size no one makes clothes for. Naruto listened. His hands had begun to tray MBLE the way they did when he'd held the light too long. He shoved both fists into his jacket pockets. The ring buzzed against his knuckles, a bee that had memorized his bones. Kakashi looked at his students and asked nothing out loud. Sasuke hitched his shoulder, the kind of shrug that meant fine, I'll find something to cut out there. Sakura's chin lifted. Naruto said, we're going, and it felt stupidly good when no one argued with him. They left the brothers' trust in a tree with a note pinned to the bark for the Konoha patrol unit. The sky thickened as they walked, the wind picking up salt and secrets. Tazuna limped faster when the sea smell grew teeth. Wave was a blue-gray grief with houses nailed to it. Children watched them the way people watch weather. Men and women moved like work was heavier here, because it was. They crossed the water in a low boat with a man who didn't tell them his name. Fog took them in like the mouth of a god with nothing to say. Once, out of the white, a shape moved, the outline of something too long. The boatman crossed himself with a gesture Naruto didn't know, then stopped halfway, embarrassed at having believed in something in public. On the far shore, the bridge rose. It was half-built and fully a miracle, pylons stabbing out of water so hungry it had eaten the sky above it. Naruto felt the world under his boots shiver. Not like danger. Like attention. He touched the railing. The metal was cold enough to bite. The wind between the pylons shoved his jacket open and clapped his shirt against his chest. For a second he thought he heard something under the waves beyond the human sounds, a low hum too patient to be a machine. What? Sasuke said. Nothing. Naruto leaned on the rail with both hands like he could push sense down into the steel. Bridge has a heartbeat. Sakura snorted. Bridges don't have hearts. People do, Naruto said, and Tazuna glanced at him as if someone had pulled a splinter the size of a tree out of his foot. They didn't have to wait long for the first man to try to stop one. Zabuza Momochi came with the fog stitched into his sleeves. He stood on the railing like a bad idea made handsome and swung in. Executioner's sword onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. Bandages covered most of his face. The visible part didn't look like it had practiced smiling in years. Hatake, he said, and it sounded like he'd found a coin he hadn't realized he'd lost. Zabuza, Kakashi said, and it sounded like he'd found a bill he really didn't want to pay. The fight started quiet. Water slid off concrete. Wind worried at shirt hems and hair. Kakashi moved first. No book now, nothing lazy left, Sharingan a red coin in a storm. Zabuza grinned under cloth and blurred, big sword pressing honest physics into dishonesty. Edge going where angles shouldn't allow. Naruto's role wasn't in the first dance. He and Sasuke and Sakura ringed Tazuna, moving as a unit. It felt different to Naruto, though, like there was a second map under the obvious one. The wind wasn't just wind, it had lines in it, currents like faint chalk marks on a dark board. When he breathed, his breath spent itself against those lines and came back with little notes. Here. Left. Wait. Now. Truth of wind didn't arrive as a named thing. It arrived as not tripping. Zabuza crowded Kakashi to the edge and vanished into a lake that hadn't been there a breath earlier. Water clones rose, cheap and effective, the air soured. Naruto stepped, and his foot found a cushion of pressure. He didn't fly. He cheated. Wingstep popped him up just enough. That the clone's blade split the mist under his sandals instead of his legs. He dropped with a smack of palms on wet concrete, spun, and the light in him came when he shoved open the door he'd been pretending wasn't there. Platinum flame spilled out like a truth. It wasn't a blast, it was a yes. It kissed the clone, and the water shivered into rain, seals hissing into nothing. Sasuke followed, threw cleanly with a kick to another clone's knee and a blade-stopping heel. Sakura got Tazuna behind a support column and drew a line on the ground that meant if you cross this line, I will cross you. Zabuza had Kakashi trapped in a sphere of water, an old hunter's trick pulled out of the bag because the old tricks work. Kakashi's face didn't change. Zabuza's pulse probably didn't either. Stay with Tazuna, Kakashi said. Voice round and strange through the water's skin, and somehow it still sounded like an order with a smile hiding behind it. Naruto. I know, Naruto said. He didn't. He felt his legs tremble anyway. He ran along the pylon and then the air beside it because the wind said yes there. A clone made of water and spite swung at his head. He ducked because he was shorter. He slid because he was clever. He slapped his palm against the clone's chest, letting the light find the thread of seal holding it together, and plucked. The clone fell apart like a trick with the wrong card. Cute, Zabuza said, and it was admiration in a language he didn't use much. His free hand flicked Senbon. Naruto twisted. Chu kissed his jacket instead of his neck. A figure appeared on the far rail. Polite and almost delicate compared to Zabuza's math. A hunter nin mask hid their face. Their hands were a whisper on the air. Senbon lanced from fingers like conversation. Quick, meant to end fights without making a mess. Naruto felt the push. A killing intent that wasn't quite that. It was carefully aimed to stop, not to delight in stopping. He saw Kakashi's head tilt in the water prison, saw the calculation flick. And knew that if someone didn't cut across the clean geometry, the story would end with a mask and a body bag and the bridge whistling in the wind as if it hadn't learned a name. He moved. Not because he was fastest. He wasn't. Not as a bodyguard. Sasuke had Tazuna's left and Sakura had his right and the line on the ground to enforce it. He moved because the wind wrote something down and dared him to correct it. He took one step on the air and then another. The second step hurt like a dentist's drill in his calves. He landed on the railing near the masked figure, B. Wreath fogging his own view for a heartbeat. The figure's eyes behind the slits of the mask flicked to him. They weren't feral. They were sad. Don't, Naruto said, and he didn't mean, don't kill. He meant, don't let them make you the thing you aren't. The head turned as if considering whether a boy on a rail had standing to make requests. The Senbon paused. That pause was everything. Kakashi used it the way rivers use downhill. The water prison dissolved. Zabuza snarled and blurred into tough angles again. Steel rang. The masked hunter moved, but not to finish. To cover. To keep the worst thin. G from happening because someone else had asked them to. Naruto had just enough time to think, okay, that's complicated, before three things happened in quick, stupid succession. First. Something snapped under the bridge. Not a support but a promise. Men shouted. A worker went down with a sound that had more panic than pain. The kind of shout that says, this would be fine if not for the poison. Second. Gato's men, emboldened by fog and mess, shoved a cart toward the heart of the bridge loaded with barrels that looked like water storage and were not. A priest with a shaved head and a silk cord around his wrist walked beside the cart, lips moving. The seals tied to the barrel hoops flashed a dirty gold. Third. The air hummed the way it had in the pinewoods when Kojiro had told him to eat. Lady Benizuru didn't walk into view. She appeared the way plans do, fully formed and already making you late. She stood on a half-built platform in lacquered black that wasn't shinobi, wasn't priest. Wasn't anything Naruto had seen on a village street. She didn't smile. She lifted a hand and light like a bad idea tried to assemble itself into a cage around the fight. Containment, she said, and her voice didn't need to be loud. It was architected. Null Halo 2, choir cell, pivot to extraction. The big ring came in low, hugging the geometry of the bridge and humming with that same wrong eat. Right logic as the little ring in Naruto's pocket. Kojiro wasn't with her, or if he was, he stayed behind the fog and the math. Two operatives moved with their hands where Naruto could see them, because they were that sort of professional. Zabuza cursed like a man whose schedule had just gotten interesting. The masked hunter's gaze flicked Benizuru's way and back, cool calculation under sadness. Kakashi's eye narrowed. Sharingan drinking information like rain. Naruto didn't have space for all the math. He had a worker on the far span coughing foam and grabbing his throat, a cart with a pre-saint chanting in barrels that smelled like a hospital on a bad day, and a ring that wanted to turn choices into a container. He picked the smallest person, because the rule on his heart like that. He ran. The halo's hum tugged at his skin. His ribs felt like they were being asked to sign a contract. He ignored it. He went low under a crossbar and then high on an angle he had no business trusting. He couldn't reach the worker in time before the poison sealed the deal. "Please," he said, to a sky that didn't owe him favors. The light came without him dragging it this time, gentle. He put his palm on the man's sternum and told the flame what not to burn. It listened. Platinum washed across skin and into blood. The ugly froth clung to his fingers with a mean will, and then it let go because something older than it had said no. The worker gagged and rolled to his side, coughing out a string of vomit that looked like it had argued with a snake. He gasped. His eyes found Naruto without finding anything else and tried to focus on gratitude with a brain still deciding whether to keep oxygen as a lifestyle. Naruto felt the cost like a bite. The scales along his chest and shoulder flickered into being for a second. Delicate hexes that looked too fine to crack. They cracked anyway, hairline lines crawling like frost across a window. Pain found his breath. The hunger behind his molars flared. "Hey," Naruto said, "because you say hello when you feel like you might pass out. You're not food." The priest by the barrels didn't like that sentence. He switched his chant to a minor key. The say, ALS on the hoops twitched and then rallied like weeds that had found an unguarded garden. Naruto lifted his head and saw what the labels meant. Not water. Souls. Tiny, mean traps meant to catch the saint heat from a dying worker and put it in a jar Gato could spend later, on luck, on fear, on breaking. No, it wasn't loud. It wasn't even out of his mouth. The rule in his chest took the word like a blacksmith takes metal and made something. Edict. No devouring. It wasn't a bolt. It was a veto. The gold letters painted on the barrel hoops wrinkled, then curled like paper over a candle without the flame. The priest gasped like someone had taken the shape of his god and bent it into a less comfortable chair. The barrels went from looking like a ritual to looking like crime. Naruto swayed. The ring, Benazuru's, hit the deck where he had been standing and threw sparks the wrong color. He shoved the worker toward Sakura's line without ceremony. She dragged the man behind the chalk mark like she had been born to enforce boundaries with small hands and a big voice. "Benazuru," one of the choir operatives called. "The edict." "I see it." Lady Benazuru's hand flexed, the kind of annoyance had belongs to people who dislike losing clean lines. "Lock down the perimeter. I will adjust." Or you could not. Kakashi was moving now, Sharingan making lies into mistakes. He slid between steel and fog, made Zabuza miss by an honest margin, and put his back to Naruto's for one breath. "Naruto, are you good?" "Define good," Naruto said, and grinned like a person who would not fall over if it killed him. "Standing. Mostly. Good." Quote. The cart barreled forward because men with narrow imaginations were still pushing it. Sasuke met it at an angle, foot to wheel, the cart skidding sideways with the scraped shriek of bad plan meeting new math. He shoved it into the guard rail with a shoulder and a growl. His eyes flicked to Naruto for a sliver. "What did you just do?" And back to the fight. Later, Naruto said to all the questions no one had time to ask. The masked hunter moved like wind turning corners. They interposed themselves between Zabuza and Kakashi for one precise heartbeat, Senbo. N flashing not toward a throat but toward a wrist, allowing Zabuza to break contact and vanish back into fog. It wasn't betrayal. It was coordination with a loyalty that didn't apologize for itself. "Who are you?" Naruto asked, genuinely curious as he slid along the rail to cut the cart off from the priest. The hunter's head tilted, the mask listening for a name that would sound right. "Haku," they said, too soft to be tactical and too clear to be a lie. "Hi," Naruto said, like they were at a festival instead of on a half-built bridge under a spell cage with a war architect frowning at them. Quote, "Can you not with the whole, assist in murdering my teacher thing?" Haku's eyes shuddered behind the mask and opened again. "Can you not ruin the life of the man I owe?" Naruto considered the question honestly. Maybe we both don't. He tried, and Haku's shoulders did that minuscule lift that admitted humor under sadness. Lady Benizuru was done letting them have human conversations. She snapped 2 fingers. The halo yawned and then changed shape, the inner edge blooming with nested circles, each inscribed with careful geometry. Naruto felt his skin try to accept a concept he refused. Kojira's ring in his pocket hummed like an old friend telling him not to be stupid. He put a hand there and felt the flaw in the metal he'd made yesterday when he'd pushed back. He thought of the note. We prefer consent to force. Benizuru. A new voice cut across the wind. It held a formal apology under the syllables like a folded letter. Kojira walked out of the fog with his talismans in place and his expression somewhere between math and mercy. Pull the engine back. You'll collapse the supports if you anchor there. You're late, she said without turning her head. I like to see if the world solves itself when I do not touch it. He said. His gaze sidled toward Naruto. It often does not. Naruto wanted to be offended. He couldn't afford it. The priest had stopped chanting and started running. Gato's men had decided that barrels without souls weren't worth dying for and were backing away like crabs. Zabuza had vanished with Haku at his side, their absence a kind of presence. Kakashi's breathing was steady but not casual. Sasuke and Sakura were bleeding in small, useful ways, the kind that let the body remember it was alive. If you're here to help, Naruto said to Kojira, help without the part where you stuff me in a jar. Kojira's mouth made the shape of a smile and then aborted the attempt. Unattractive phrase, he said. He looked at Benizuru. If we press now, Hatake will make us regret the timing. The boy's edict is newborn and obedient to his choices. Predict that before you sit the ring on him or don't sit it at all. Benizuru's jaw tightened an almost invisible degree. She lowered her hand. The halo shrank. Sullen. Withdraw. It's a weekday, she said, as if that mattered to anyone but her. We do not antagonize on weekdays. It teaches the wrong lesson. Naruto blinked. What lesson is that? That the world bends when one boy shouts, she said. I prefer it bend when communities agree. Then she was gone. The 2 operatives with her peeled out of sight, stepping into fog like it had doorways only they knew. Kojira lingered a moment longer, as if he had forgotten something and couldn't remember what it was. He met Naruto's eyes and was suddenly, brutally human. Don't let her catch you on a Sunday, he said, and then he, too, let the fog eat him. Naruto laughed, a small, exhausted bark that felt like a cough pretending to be brave. Then he leaned over ND put his hands on his knees until the horizon stopped tilting. Platinum light skittered away from his skin like a dog that had been asked to go lie down. The cracks in his scales ached and then beard they were only there when he asked too much of them. Sit, Sakura said. It was not a suggestion. She pushed him onto a slab of wet concrete and put a hand on his forehead like she was trying to read his thoughts through his skin. You burned too hard. Did not, Naruto said, which was a child's lie and tasted sweet and stupid. Sasuke snorted and tore a strip from his shirt to wrap a worker's forearm. You did, moron, he said without much bite. But you picked the right places to be an idiot. Kakashi stood with his hands in his pockets and his eye half-lidded like the fight had been a morning jog. We're not done, he said mildly. Zabuza will be back. Hunters don't leave a job undone, and Benizuru doesn't either. Naruto let his head fall back and looked up. The sky above the Bridge had stopped scowling and started sulking, the kind of weather that can be bribed with a good story. He breathed. The wind on the span said things he didn't have words for, but he knew what it meant. They made a camp near the bridgework where the wind didn't try to shove you into the sea. Chizuna's daughter-in-law brought food with the set mouth of someone who hadn't decided if thanking strangers would break something in her. Naruto ate like a person who had thought about swallowing a ring just to quiet his pocket and then decided to settle for noodles. The ache in his chest eased. The tray, more in his hands, subsided the way a wave does when it gets tired of being seen. He dozed and woke to the scuff of sandals and a voice muttering curses that were too creative for Gato's thugs. He pushed up on his elbows. The girl had red hair the color of blood in a story, eyes that could set a room on fire if you didn't take their temperature carefully, and a posture that said, "Try me." Rope marked her wrists, and she had torn it herself, which explained the cursing. You all are terrible kidnappers, she told the empty air. Then she saw Naruto and narrowed her eyes. You're not them. Nope, Naruto said, because facts help when the world is made of fog and ringing. Hi, she said warily. Name's Karen. Don't use it like we're friends unless you're about to untie the rest of this. Sakura moved before Naruto could. A kunai nicking the last of the rope with neat irritation. Who tied you? She asked. Gato's men. Wanted a censor and a medic who works cheap. Karen rubbed her wrists and winced. Joke's on them. I don't work cheap. Or for them. Why were you with them? Sasuke asked, because his brain was made of knives that cut to useful shapes. Karen looked away for a second, mouth tightening. I was between villages, she said. People with eyes like mine don't get to be between things for long. Naruto felt the edge of the truth and didn't press. We could use a censor, he said. If you want to be with a village that's annoying but not murderous. Karen stared at him like he'd offered her soup and an insult. Then her gaze dropped to his chest, to the place where his shirt stuck a little to the faintly reddened pattern of scales that weren't there anymore. What are those? She asked, voice sharp and hungry in a different way. That's not chakra burn. Naruto's hand went up automatically and then stopped halfway, as if it had remembered a note in his pocket. He shrugged. Allergy, he said. To what? Karen said flatly. Weather. To being eaten, Naruto said before he could stop himself. The word tasted like iron and something cleaner. Bad ideas. Karen blinked and then, to his surprise, laughed. Fine, she said. I'll help you not get eaten by your allergy. But I want out when you make it boring. It's never boring, Naruto said solemnly, and that was not a promise, it was a threat against boredom. They slept poorly and woke into mist. Zab. Uza came back with Haku at his shoulder and a commitment to endings. The fight on the unfinished span felt like standing on the tongue of a beast that was trying to decide whether to swallow. Kakashi and Zabuza found each other the way old enemies do, with relief like punishment. Haku faced Naruto with the sigh of someone who had come to complete a sentence and wished it could be a different sentence. Do we have to? Naruto asked, because sometimes the most tactical question is a human one. Yes, Haku said, and the sympathy under it didn't move their hands at all. They moved. Mirrors blossomed around Naruto, ice-like cathedral windows, each showing him 1,000 small hymns who all looked a fraction unsure. Senbon flickered, greedy for arteries without wanting to taste. Naruto stepped where the wind said it was okay. He let the light out in small, mean sips, just enough to make the mirrors forget their edges. He didn't burn the art. Haku's breath hitched behind the mask the way a Cr. Aftsman's does when someone respects the work even as they break it. Out on the main span, Zabuza pinned Kakashi in a heartbeat and then lost him in the next. A flurry of exchange that was more conversation than violence ended with steel and blood and a gap that a boy could fit into and a man might fall through. The Sable Choir didn't interrupt this time. Maybe they were keeping weekdays, as Benizuru had said like a joke. Maybe Kojiro had told her something about consent. Maybe the fog had its own rules about how many ghosts could stand on one bridge at once. The ring in Naruto's pocket buzzed like a bee asleep and dreaming of work. When the moment came, the one where choices make weight lines in the air, it was small. Haku had the angle on Kakashi's hand. A Senbon would mean a dropped kunai and a hole in the next 10 seconds where Zabuza could put his sword. Naruto didn't shout. He put his palm up toward Haku and said, please. The light that came wasn't a blare. It was a hand on a wrist. It tapped the mirror at just the right place, and the image inside wavered. Haku's Senbon flicked 1 degree off a kill and landed in a part of Kakashi's arm that hurt without ending him. Kakashi's eye slid to Naruto with a heat behind the Sharingan that wasn't anger, like someone had turned a mirror to catch lightning. Zabuza cursed with love in it for the fact that things kept being more difficult than he hoped. He moved to finish the version of the fight where monsters win because they are allowed to be simple. The simplicity died with Gato. He arrived on the span with men and paid bravado and shouted about the price of bridges and the dividend of fear. He brought prisoners he thought were leverage. He brought a kid with a black eye and a woman with her mouth set like a door that had learned to lock itself. He brought the idea that money can end stories. Zabuza turned his head, just a little. Gato smiled like he had realized where his weight went. Kill them, Gato said, nodding toward the bound workers and then, with petty relish, toward Haku. Start with the pretty one. Make it hurt. Zabuza's body didn't move. Inside him, something did. He had done ugly for money, so he had learned how to convert disgust into rent. But there are moments where a man stands on a bridge he didn't build and looks at a coward telling him to burn it and finds he has a spine that doesn't care about coin. What if? Zabuza said, voice low, sword low, I kill you. Gato's goons stepped forward, then stepped back, because the way Zabuza said it made their feet remember their mothers. He charged, not at Kakashi, at Gato. It wasn't noble, it was honest. He carved through the first rank like a man reminding the world it had laws. He took blows that would kill later and didn't care. He was beautiful in the awful way a storm is when it remembers to be a storm. Naruto moved without thinking, not toward Zabuza, toward the prisoners Gato had brought to make fear into a lever. To war. The barrels that still had mean little charms tied to them even though he'd said no earlier. A man with a weasel face lunged at a woman with a cord around her wrist as if cutting it would make him tall. Naruto put his hand on the man's sleeve and burned the thought out of the fabric. He looked at the woman and said, run, and she did, dragging the kid with the black eye like he was a bag of rice. Haku hesitated. It wasn't tactical, it was human. They pivoted, and then suddenly they were a wall beside Zabuza, Senbon turning into something more honest, steel and commitment. Kakashi didn't smile. He cut down two men with movements pared down to the minimum number of truths. Gato died like rich men do when they run out of chessboards. He didn't understand the moment until it was teeth. Zabuza took his head off and then, finally, ran out of future. The men who had come for money decided they had spent enough. Not all ran. Enough did. Zabuza knelt because his body had done the math and found the sum. Haku's hands were on him. Steady, furious in a quiet way, desperate with a competence that had learned to live in a world without spare hearts. Naruto walked to them because the wind said to. And because no rule had told him not to. You did it your way, he said to Zabuza. Not his. Zabuza's laugh was a cough full of salt and regret and amusement at the last very stupid joke the world had told him. Kid, he said, and there was a lot inside that word. Pity, respect, the annoyance you feel at the sunrise when you wanted one more hour of night. You always talk this much. Only when it matters, Naruto said. Haku looked up at him. The mask had a crack that spidered across it like a map of an escape. Their eyes were wet and perfectly clear. Can you? Naruto knew the question. He couldn't do that. Not this. Not yet. He could say no to devouring and burn poison out and stop a ring from making consent into an equation. He could not stop a man who had chosen to spend himself from paying the whole bill. I can make it clean, he said, and didn't apologize for the gap between what he wished and what he could do. Haku nodded. It was a terrible, grateful motion. Naruto put a hand on Zabuza's shoulder. The light came without being asked to show off. It went where the ugliest of the pain had nested and lifted it, just enough for the last breaths to be something other than a struggle. Zabuza's eyes closed. His mouth moved like he might make a joke at the ceiling of the world. He didn't, in the end. He left like a man who had served the wrong king and finally paid the right tax. The wind took the fog apart. Work began, the kind with rope and hands. Chizuna's people came with faces that had been told by life to keep their expressions inside and forgot the order. The dead were counted. The living were gathered. The bridge stood like someone had asked it a question and it had answered with granite. Lady Benizuru didn't return. Kojira didn't appear. The ring in Naruto's pocket stopped humming and just sat there like metal. Naruto helped lift, stack, knot. He let his hands be hands. He watched Haku wrap Zabuza with the competence of love. He didn't say I'm sorry. It wasn't the right time for apologies. It was the right time for presence. Karen moved through the wounded with a sensor's economy, calling out where pressure would help and where breath needed coaching. She came to Naruto last and smacked the back of his head lightly with 2 fingers. You burn like an idiot, she said, which was both an observation and a new relationship dynamic. I don't know what the right amount is. Naruto admitted. I do, Karen said. Ask me next time. He nodded. It felt like a vow in the small, useful way, not like a prophecy. He liked it. They named the bridge Slow. WLY, even though names are the fastest things humans do. They didn't call it Naruto Bridge because that would have made Naruto into a monument and he would have had to move. They called it something th. It tasted like what had happened rather than who had done it. Someone said, freedom, someone else said, storm, and the two words sat next to each other without elbowing. Naruto stood on the span and the last of the fog let go and the light on the water made him squint. He stepped up onto the rail because habit had made him a little bit stupid. He thought, just to see, about the sky. He took a breath. He didn't fly. He lingered. His foot left the stone and found something for a heartbeat that wasn't air and wasn't water and wasn't a promise. He hung there, ridiculous and small and not small, with the sea under him and the sky above making up its mind. The wind shoved his hair like a friend. He dropped back down before anyone could gasp, before he had to explain, before he had to decide if he'd lied to himself. He grinned at the horizon because he wanted to. On the walk back to the village, Sasuke fell in step with him without making it obvious. That thing you did, he said. You'll have to be more specific, Naruto said. Solemn as an altar. The not kill, Sasuke said. With the mask. You saw something I didn't. Naruto shrugged. The wind told me they didn't want to. Not really. I just gave them room to choose. Sasuke rolled that around in his mouth like a coin. He said at last, which for him meant, I will think about that until it annoys me less. Sakura walked on Naruto's other side. We should get ramen when we get back, she said. Before you try to feed your ring. Naruto laughed. I thought I was hiding it. You shake when you stop, Sakura said, with a glance as precise as a scalpel. And you keep touching that pocket like it's going to run away. Also you look happier when your mouth is full. Facts, Naruto admitted. Kakashi ambled behind them like a scarecrow that had learned to move. You all did well, he said. You did not die. You did not let a village do the same. These are the sort of outcomes that allow me to nap with a clear conscience. Tazuna snorted and didn't try to make it a speech. He clapped Naruto on the back once, hard enough to rattle ribs, which is how men who build things say thank you when their throats don't like the word. Naruto pretended it didn't hurt. He grinned, and this time it didn't feel like stealing. When the boat pushed off, Wave receded like a bruise thinking about healing. On the water, Naruto leaned against the bow and watched the bridge get smaller without feeling like it was forgetting him. A gull rode a crosswind and yelled about fish in a voice like a cranky uncle. Hey, Karen said, sidling up with the ease of someone who had decided she was going wherever she wanted. You're taking me to Konoha. I'll make myself useful and then decide if I hate it. Deal, Naruto said. He looked out at the place where the waves changed color because the bottom changed shape and felt the thrum of the world under the boat, faint and steady. He didn't know if it was a dragon load, or just a beautiful phrase he'd make up later. He knew it made the back of his neck feel like a door had just cracked open somewhere in the air. Also, Karen added, and poked his chest right where the scales had cracked. Don't do that without asking me. Which part? Naruto said, genuinely confused. The part where you pretend your body is a note you can play until it tears, she said. You don't get to be a king of anything if you burn the crown to keep your hands warm. He had to think about that. The wind hit his face. He laughed, but softly. Okay, he said, help me not do that. I already am, she said, and flicked his forehead. Because affection in certain languages needs a little insult to balance it. Konoha's wall rose, then gates, then streets. Iruka was waiting where he always somehow was when Naruto came back from something heavier than he should have had to carry. He took one look and nodded as if Naruto had passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. Ramen, Iruka said. Ramen, Naruto agreed. The evening stretched like a cat. Steam rose. The bowl sat in front of Naruto like it had been made for that exact moment. He ate. He stopped shaking. Later, alone on the same silly tower of that pretended to be more than it was, Naruto pulled Kojira's ring out of his pocket. It lay in his palm, ordinary, flawed where he had shoved it, weirdly comforting. He thought of Benizuru's clean voice. He thought of Haku's soft yes. He thought of Zabuza's laugh when he chose which king to pay. He lifted the ring to the sky and said, to the air and whoever used it as a chalkboard, I'm not trying to be everyone's god. I just want to keep the small parts of the world from being eaten. If you want to help with that, I'll take it. If you don't, stay out of my way on Sundays. The ring did not glow. It did nothing, which is how some important things happen. He lay back on the tiles and watched clouds pass like ships. The hunger was quieter tonight. The cracks in his scales had stopped singing. His feet remembered where not to step when he walked on air. In the distance, thunder grumbled without commitment. Naruto smiled at it like an old rival he'd decided to share a drink with someday. Tomorrow, Chunin exams registration. Tomorrow, a village with more eyes than secrets. Tomorrow, a girl with white eyes who waved at him like she was shy and brave at the same time. Tomorrow, choices. Tonight, he let the sky be big and himself be small and did not try to solve it. He closed his eyes and slept without dreams, and if something old watched him from a bowl of water in a place the wind keeps in its pocket. It did so without comment. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Leaves in a rising gale. The exam hall smelled like pencils lying about their innocence. Rows of rookies hunched over sheets, the air a taut string. Naruto stared at question 1 and wanted to punch it. He shifted in his chair, the black ring from Kojira a cool coin in his pocket, and tried to think of anything except how quiet the room was. He could hear hearts, not with his ears, something subtler. The wind that slid through cracked windows and under the door carried the tiny drumbeats of nerves and concentration, ahoo. Ndred small storms pushed into human bodies. His own tempo was all elbows and knees. Hinata, 2 seats over, breathed like a lantern. Sakura's pencil wrote confidence. Sasuke's scratches were arrogant in a way that had rhythm anyway. Ibiki moved down the aisle with the patience of a kettle about to whistle. Naruto didn't look at him. He looked at the paper and thought, I'm not here to be the smartest. I'm here to be here. The first 10 minutes stretched. He wrote his name boldly like a man who owned something and left the rest of the page blank. He didn't feel ashamed. He felt steady. He breathed with Hinata for 3 counts. Heard her exhale hitch and settle. He imagined the light in him, quiet and folded, not trying to fix a test with a roar. The urge to cheat went past him like a stranger on a rainy street. The urge to run did, too. Ibiki's 10th question came like thunder in a room that had been pretending it wasn't stormy. Fail if you fail. Leave and you don't come back. Whispers climbed the walls like spiders. Chairs scraped. A boy stood, then sat, then stood again with tears he refused to name. Naruto raised his hand and didn't wait to be called on. I'm not leaving, he said. He wasn't grand. He was stubborn. His voice wasn't loud. It was placed. The wind that lived under the door picked it up and set it down across the room with more care than he deserved. Ibiki's eyes flicked to him, to the blank page, to the clean line of a kid who had decided to stay. Something like a grin nudged the scar on his cheek and then thought better of it. Then don't, Ibiki said. 2 rows over, a girl lowered her hand and stopped crying. At Naruto's left, a boy who had already stood sat again, spine finding a shape a spine ought to have. Hinata's shoulder eased in a way that felt like permission. Naruto fought a smile and lost. By the time the rules turned into a pass and the room exhaled as one entity, Naruto's pencil had still written nothing useful. But his hands had stopped shaking. That, he'd take. They spilled outdoors into a waiting sun that lit the high walls gold. The next proctor, Anko, arrived like a knife wrapped in jokes. She tossed a banner at a wall with her F.R.E. hand and pinned it from 30 feet away while telling them all to stop being boring. Naruto liked her immediately. His stomach did, too, which Karen noticed. Eat, she said, appearing at his ELB. I'll like a footnote to his life that had decided to become a chapter. You shake when you stop. You read my mail now, Naruto said, patting his pocket where Kojira's note lived like a secret kept casually. Your blood, she said. It has mail in it if you know how to read. He tore open a rice ball and wolfed it, smiling with his mouth full at Hinata, who pretended not to see and failed at pretending. Tamari of the sand brushed past them with a big fan slung across her back and a smirk that belonged to someone who had already solved 3 of your problems and was deciding if she should charge you for it. Nice speech, Leaf, she said without looking at him, which somehow made it worse. Try one that works on a battlefield. Naruto grinned up at her. I prefer bridges. She blinked, very briefly. Her mouth quirked. Noted. They entered the forest of death with warnings about permission slips and snakes that didn't need warning. Gates swallowed them in 2s and 3s. Trees closed ranks over their heads, telling stories with bark. The wind was different here, older, made complicated by branches and history. Sakura took point on navigation, orders crisp. Sasuke shadowed the left flank. Naruto lagged half a step on purpose to watch the places where the undergrowth concealed shapes that weren't shrubs. Karen drifted like a ghost with a bad attitude, eyes half-lidded, attention on the far currents only she could hear. Left, she murmured, and a tripwire came into focus where Naruto's eyes had wanted to forgive the vine for being where it was. They moved like they'd trained foe. This exact day in a life they hadn't actually had. Naruto felt good. It scared him a little. He kept one hand near his chest, where the scales came when choices clawed at him. The first genin ambush was amateur. The second had fangs. A giant snake uncurled from a hollow log with the languid aplomb of a noble being asked to lower itself. It went for Naruto because appetites learn quick. He stepped. The ground wasn't enough. The air was, for one heartbeat, soft. He put a palm to the snake's head and told the light not to burn flesh, only the idea that it had borrowed. The snake flinched, blinked, and recoiled as if embarrassed. The woman who had called it smiled with the kind of leisurely malice that makes small animals go still. Orochimaru's tongue tasted the air around them like a man reading the room and savoring it. Little inheritance, he said, voice a silk rope. How rare. Kakashi wasn't here to stand between this and stupid. Team 7 stood for itself. Sasuke's killing intent sharpened to a point. Sakura's fear turned into available hands. Karen's face went white with a sensor's recognition of too much. Naruto did not want to show the stranger the dragon in his pocket. He took a breath and rolled his shoulders. We're busy, he said. Test. Trees. You know. Orochimaru's eyes half closed as if he'd just heard a child tell a joke he'd learned from a wall. Open your mouth, he said. And a tangle of snakes became a single arrow. Naruto met it. He didn't go loud. He kept the light close to his skin and let it harden in a small, mean layer. The scales flashed and took the bite. Hexes ringing like a struck glass. Pain slid into his ribs and started looking for furniture. He shoved back, not with heat, but with the rule he had made in a rain-soaked clearing. No devouring. The snakes recoiled. The word got into them somehow. Had to, because they were summoned to do exactly that. They were an appetite turned into a rope. Orochimaru's smile widened a fraction. My, he said. Someone gave you a law. Naruto's mouth set. I made one. Orochimaru stepped through a swirl of leaves that shouldn't have made a person. His hand flicked and a seal bead landed on Naruto's collarbone like a kiss that meant to mainline poison. The light jumped without being asked. It burned the bead without touching Naruto's skin. The smell was temple cold. Orochimaru's pupils dilated to slits. Not in fear. There wasn't much of that left in him, but in surprise that had a compliment in it. Sasuke moved. He didn't go for Orochimaru. He severed a snake that had crept behind Naruto. Sakura flung tags with angles that made math jealous. Karen's hands pressed against Naruto's spine and rifled through his chakra like she owned a library card. Do not overburn, she hissed. You crack when you get proud. Not proud, Naruto said, teeth tight. Stubborn. Same, she said. Orochimaru tilted his head as if listening to another conversation in a different room. Charming, he murmured. Then he was close. Then his breath dwelled against Naruto's cheek as his hand shaped a brand that felt like an attempt to ride a leash into a boy. The seal didn't land clean. The flame came up in a flat, bright plane and met the brand like a priest saying no in a way even gods heard. Platinum kissed the snake sigil and made it into nothing. For a heartbeat Orochimaru looked, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with eating. He had found an equation that did not balance and loved it for the work it promised. You'll do, he whispered, not to Sasuke this time, and that made the world shift sideways. Hard pass, Naruto said, and drove a shin into Orochimaru's knee with a human amount of force because he'd decided not every answer needed to be a miracle. They didn't win. They didn't lose. Orochimaru left the way smoke leaves a room, coiling around a new idea and taking it with him. Naruto sagged against a tree and breathed like he was trying to convince air to understand. Sakura's hands were clean and fast, bandaging Sasuke where he wouldn't be vain about it. Karen pressed 2 fingers to Naruto's sternum and frowned. "You lit your scales in the wrong direction," she said. "We need to tune you." "Like a lute," he said, because banter made the fear live somewhere smaller. "Like an engine," she said. "You're running hot." He nodded, trying to learn his own inside. A sliver of metal glinted at the edge of his vision. He turned. A talisman pinned under bark watched them like an eye. "Karen," he said. She was already there. She plucked it with one precise twist. "Sable Choir," she said, a sourness curling her mouth. "They tag the old places. They'll see you if you don't keep your light out of the window." "Then I won't light a lantern unless I have to," Naruto said. He tucked the talisman into his pouch. He kept Kojira's ring in his pocket. He thought of Benizuru's clean voice. Eat, choose, agree. He wondered which choices would make him someone they decided had to be solved. They finished the forest tired and not dead, which counts. In the payphone silence before the preliminaries, Temari leaned on a railing and looked down at the ring of stone where everyone would be expected to answer the meanest question the world asks: who are you when it watches? "You sure you don't want the easy way?" she asked Naruto, which was only half a joke. "There's an easy way," he said, genuinely curious. "Win loudly," she said, and glanced at his chest where the cracks from the forest had scabbed his flourishes. "Make a myth. It pays." He thought of bridges and barrels, masks and men who changed their minds. "I want to win quietly," he said. "But I'll take loud if it keeps people standing." Temari huffed, almost a laugh. "Fine, I'll win loudly. You pick up the things I knock down." "That's our style," he said. Preliminaries were an assassin's gallery. Bodies tested each other. Pride tripped on its shoelaces. Naruto stepped into his match and chose angles that looked dumb until they worked. He didn't flash flame. He used wingstep once to be where a fist wasn't, then let the ground hold him like it held everyone else. He won with a throw that stole balance rather than a blow that broke bone. The crowd didn't roar. He was weirdly satisfied with that. Hinata's match was a wire pulled too tight. Neji came with the solemn arrogance of a man convinced by math. Hinata bowed like someone who had learned to argue with fate without raising her voice. When Neji's words cut the air, Naruto's palm itched with the need to lay a law on the floor: guard the small. The light rider in him stirred. He held it and watched Hinata fight her cousin, fight his prediction more than his palms. She moved like water that had learned definition. Neji drove her to the DGE where the body rolls over and remembers it's made of more than one thing. She looked at Naruto once and found him standing, not telling the world to protect her and not letting it turn away either. She lost neatly and refused to be broken. She stood with blood at her lip and air in her lungs and bowed deeply enough that the word respect learned a new angle. Naruto clutched his own shirt with his fingers to keep them from taking liberties with edicts he had to earn. When they reached her, when the match and the murmurs had moved on, Naruto didn't say sorry. He said, "You were all yours," and she blinked quick. And a smile flickered and hid. Karen's mouth softened in a way she'd deny. "Good," she murmured. "Don't make a temple around her. Make a road." Sasuke won because he was Sasuke and because other boys try not to die when the room is red. Sakura cheated gloriously with preparation disguised as instinct and shocked a girl who had assumed pink was for softness. Temari folded Tenten out of the air with wind and competence and looked bored while doing it. Tenten looked angry exactly once and promised herself something that Naruto hoped involved more practice and better friends. The month between preliminaries and finals held more quiet than Naruto knew how to store. He trained. He learned where the wind wanted his feet. He let Karen put marks on his skin that tugged his chalk raw away from the cliff's edge just long enough for him to remember he could step back on his own. He and Temari argued about tactics with the pleasant heat of people who enjoy being wrong until they make each other right. Hinata spent exactly 7 evenings on rooftops with him and they didn't call it anything. Once, she rested her head against the parapet near his shoulder, perfectly proper, and He could feel her trust like a cord he must not set on fire. The day of the finals dawned clean out of spite for a week of rain. The stadium swelled with 1,000 heartbeats and a dozen agendas. Naruto breathed the space the crowd was making and made himself smaller inside it. He could feel where the edges were, the place where a shout turns into a stampede, the place where spectacle becomes a riot. He hated knowing that. He was grateful for it, too. The matches start when you put your foot down. They continued until the sound under the noise pulled taut, the invasion like a word spoken by too many throats. Sound shinobi moved in rehearsed confusion. Sand flared in patterns that weren't friendly. Genjutsu fell like gauze. People slept. People screamed. The sky bent in that peculiar way it does when a biju starts waking and refuses to behave like an animal. Naruto located the first new center. Gaara, brittle and brilliant, eyes like someone had painted a storm behind glass. Shukaku's shadow frothed around him. Sand fangs finding shapes they wanted to keep. Temari stood between him and the world with a fan and a big sister's fury. Her face when she saw Naruto approach said, "I will make you pay if you shame him." "I'm not here to shame him," Naruto said quickly, because he had learned something. "I'm here because the crowd doesn't deserve to be collateral for a math problem." The first Shukaku blast wasn't aimed. It didn't have to be. A slab of air tore free of its propriety and punched toward a wedge of bleachers where civilians held each other like ideas. Naruto stepped into it with nothing ready but a choice. World Shield arrived like a concept that had been waiting for a better verb. The air curved. The pressure that wanted to be catastrophe slid along a plane and lifted. Screaming its frustration into the sky. The blast tore a hole in a cloud and kept going until it was nobody's problem. The new edict cost more than anything he'd done since the bridge. The scales along his ribs sang in pain and then cracked the way dry paint does when the sun lies about winter. He tasted metal and stubbornness. Across the stadium, Kojiro stood on a ledge, talismans quiet, evaluating. Benizuru wasn't in sight. Naruto ignored them both. He had a boy to see and a monster that was not the monster everyone would name. He moved toward Gaara not as a conquering hero but as a disaster relief worker. Temari's fan snapped open in warning. He held up a hand without light this time. "Give me a minute," he said to her. "If he hates it, hit me with your biggest wind." Her eyes narrowed. "He hates everything. He loves being safe," Naruto said, and the words surprised them both with their plainness. Gaara's sand reached for him with the reflex of a body guarding an open wound. Naruto didn't burn it. He let it rub against his palm until it learned he wasn't here to take. He stepped into the field of tyranny, the heavy, bad gravity that comes when a big fear decides to speak for everyone. His new edict reached up through him like a shout that had learned to whisper. Kings do. It wasn't a crown so much as weight redistribution. The air around Gaara changed pressure, just a little. The tyrant field sagged, petty. The part of Gaara that enjoyed hearing panic shut its mouth for a second and, in that second, other parts of Gaara could hear themselves again. "Do you want to leave?" Naruto asked. "Not the stadium. The state." He didn't flinch when sand crawled up his arm like a hand insisting it was a weapon. "I want," Gaara said, and the word came out like glass. Then the other thing inside him shoved. Angry at being given a vote less easily exploited. Shukaku bellowed. The stadium groaned. Naruto swallowed. "Okay," he said, to Temari, to Hinata at his back, to Karen on a stairwell counting his breath. To the wind. "We'll do both," he dove. The next blast would have broken the second tier and the ribs of 18 people and the will of a village newly reminded of what it fears. Naruto let World Shield take it and slant upward. His calves screamed. The scales tried to leave his body and he told them, "No, we do this together." Temari's fan carved a sidewind that made the redirected blast clean. Hinata's voice cut the chaos in his ear. 2 steps right, then low, and he was where he needed to be when a piece of stone decided to forget being a pillar. Kakashi's hand found his shoulder once, like a father's presence disguised as a professional nudge, and was gone. Sasuke went toward things that needed cutting. Sakura turned bleachers into triage. The stadium began being brave. Gaara lost and found himself 3 times in a minute. On the third, Naruto reached him. He didn't touch his chest because Temari would have removed his hands at the wrists. He touched T. He air in front of Gaara's face as if he were touching the water in a barrel that reflected a boy. You're not food, Naruto said softly, and Sand that wasn't listening listened. He let kings do the quiet work of telling tyranny to rest. He didn't make it a spectacle. He made it a mercy. Shukaku swung a final ugly arm at the crowd like a drunk at a dinner table. Naruto's bones decided to hold. He threw World Shield over the nearest 50 people and it took the blow like a roof. The impact rang through him, a bell no one else heard. Up above, clouds tore again and light rushed in. Silence happens after impossible physics. Then sound rolls back, slow at first, as people consider whether cheering is permitted. No one cheered. It wasn't that sort of miracle. It was the sort that makes a thousand bodies remember how to sit down without being pieces. Tamari closed her fan slowly. Her eyes were wet and furious and relieved in a way she would argue with later. Do not tell anyone I said thank you, she said. I won't, Naruto said, breath hitching because his ribs had decided to bill him. Gaara's sand fell like exhausted wings. His eyes found Naruto's and did not look away. You spoke to it, he said. Naruto shrugged, wincing. I yelled at gravity. Gaara blinked and was 11 for a heartbeat. I hate you, he said, without heat, like a tired man saying he hated rain. Then, come to my village and we will fight where it is honest. Pass, Tamari snapped. We'll visit, Naruto said, because he had learned you can accept a challenge without picking the time. Gaara's mouth twitched. Tamari sighed through her nose and decided to keep him alive despite his mouth. By the time the first wave of sand and sound pulled back and the last genjutsu snapped like a rubber band, Konoha was messy and intact. People stood up and counted the number of themselves and found it was still one. Naruto sat down on a step because the world had started to tilt in a petty, unhelpful way, and Rin crouched and slammed a rice ball into his hand like she was throwing him a rope. Eat, she said. Yes, Captain, he said around a mouthful, and almost laughed when the ring in his pocket hummed like it agreed. In the quiet after chaos, under the stands where the cement smelled like secrets and the lights hummed like arguments, Naruto walked alone for a breath he should not have taken. The corridor was a decent throat. The air ahead of him tightened. Kojiro stepped out of the shadow with his 7 talismans and his face that had forgotten how to be young. 2 choir operatives ghosted behind him, hands empty. Posture uninterested in being scary. A halo lay flat on the floor like a coin on a bet. We prefer invitations to hunts, Kojiro said in the tone of a man continuing a conversation after a month-long pause. You did not leave one. Been busy, Naruto said, and his voice didn't shake. He wasn't sure if that was bravery or hunger. Kojiro's gaze dropped to Naruto's chest, where the cracks were red and honest. He didn't smile. Yes. He flicked 2 fingers. The halo lifted by a breath. Don't, Naruto said. He didn't make light. He didn't roar. He said it the way you tell a dog to drop a shoe. Why? Kojiro asked. Not rhetorical. He wanted the math. Because I'll lose my temper, Naruto said. And then your people get hurt. And then I have to live with that. Kojiro's eyes warmed like banked coals. The halo paused mid-rise, awaiting new instructions. What if you leave with us and return when you know what you are? What if I learn that by staying, Naruto said, and you help by not being a problem today? Behind Kojiro, the second operative's hand twitched toward a talisman. The first shook their head half an inch. Kojiro noticed everything and nothing changed in his face. You are not the only variable, he said. There is a woman in my organization who thinks you are a lever. She is very good at levers. Benizuru, Naruto said. Yes, he sighed, which turned him human for a heartbeat. She is not wrong often enough to improve her temper. The halo lifted a fraction more. The world gathered like a knee before a jump. Naruto didn't crack his light. He didn't have to. A hand landed on the halo at a seam Naruto had not seen and pressed. Hinata stood there where she wasn't supposed to be, Byakugan open, veins delicate at her temples, courage easy. Her Ingertip found the junction of 2 chitin lines and disrupted them like a child snapping a toy just so. The halo chimed. It didn't drop. It thought about dropping. Excuse me, Hinata said in a voice so polite it turned into steel halfway through. Your geometry is wrong here. Kojiro blinked. He crouched without offense and examined the ring where she had indicated. His mouth did that aborted almost smile again. He didn't look up when he spoke. Hyuga techniques are very rude. Hinata didn't step back. So is kidnapping. Touché. Kojiro stood. He raised both hands and the halo settled, then rolled, then folded itself like paper. He slid it into a case. We will schedule a better argument. He looked at Naruto in a way that made Naruto feel seen in both the ways he wanted and the ways he'd been trying to hide. You keep choosing people, Kojiro said. That will make you predictable. That will make you dangerous. For now it makes you tolerable. High praise, Naruto said, light-headed and steady in a stupid way. Kojiro glanced at Hinata, to Karen emerging at Naruto's back with a blade and a look, to the stadium air where Temari's wind would reach if she needed to Kakashi so. Were above them like a cat that knew every wire in the walls. He inclined his head, the barest bow a man gives a problem he respects. We will come back, he said, and this time it was not a threat or an appointment. It was a weather report. They left without making the corridor feel like it had been robbed. Hinata exhaled after a long-held breath. Naruto slumped against the wall and slid down. It until he was sitting on concrete trying to remember how to be Bones. Thank you, he said. Hinata looked at him, and the shape of the moment said something without needing a name. You were going to tell them no, she said. I just made it easier to keep your word. It's nice to have helped to be brave, Naruto admitted. Karen reached down and flicked the last halo residue from the floor with her toe like it offended her. You owe me a nap after I finish cursing you out, she said. Deal, he said, and meant both parts. They climbed back into daylight. The stadium had stopped being a place where a bad idea had tried to make an argument. It had gone back to being a circle where people sometimes agreed to watch other people make decisions at speed. Smoke drifted away. The sky mended itself with lazy clouds. Somewhere, Benizuru's neat mouth was thinning over a report. Somewhere else, Orochimaru licked his teeth and thought of brands that would require more work. Somewhere else, a boy Suna tried out the word hate again and found it fit a little worse than yesterday. Naruto went home by way of rooftops. He took 2 steps on air for the joy of it and then stopped before he made a habit out of cheating. He ate with Iruka, who pretended not to have counted how many times Naruto's bowl needed to be refilled before his hands stopped shivering. He watched Hinata walk down a street her shoulders set at an angle that meant she had decided on something private and right. He traded barbs with Temari and lost some of them on purpose because it made her laugh. He let Karen draw his chest with ink that would pull heat away from dangerous places and hum lullabies to his scales. At midnight, he climbed to his silly tower and sat with Kojiro's ring in his palm. It didn't hum. He looked at the sky that had just carried a Biju blast away on a vector he had made and felt something inside him settle. He didn't ask for more power. He asked for better choices. He said it out loud because words have weight. A breeze climbed his cheek like a hand. Down on the street, a night patrol argued in small voices about tea. Naruto smiled and didn't pretend he wasn't still a kid. Okay, he told the sky. Fine, I'll be the predictable kind of dangerous. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Shrine That Refused to Kneel. The letter smelled like old cedar and a priest's idea of urgency. Cockish. I slid it across the table at Ichiraku like a bill nobody wanted to pay. Steam fogged Naruto's face and made the ink swim. Temari sat 2 stools down pretending she hadn't ordered her 3rd bowl because Konoha broth was fine. And Hinata's chopsticks clicked carefully, counting mouthfuls like a quiet metronome. Karen drank tea meditatively, which for her meant glaring at it between sips. Escort request, Kakashi said. Land of demons, high risk, high superstition. Client insists on Naruto specifically. Why me? Naruto asked around a mouthful. Kakashi eyed the rising steam. Prophecy, probably. Temari snorted. Or rumors. You've been busy. Hinata glanced at Naruto, unease faint as a tremor under her calm. The shrine there. They keep records of, she stopped. Of things people shouldn't try to keep. Sold, Naruto said, because being wanted for the wrong reason still felt marginally better than not being wanted. When do we leave? Now, Kakashi said, and the bowl in front of Naruto became something you finish with intent. They met Shion at the border road where the trees traded green for slate. She wore white as if the color owed her something and didn't blink at the wind that kept touching her hair like a lover. Her eyes weren't haughty. They were busy. She took one good look at Naruto, then at the ring barely visible in his pocket, then at the sky, and sighed like a mathematician who's seen this proof 3 times already. You will die, she said, as if ordering tea. Unless you do what I tell you. Naruto smiled. I'll probably do what you ask if you ask like a person. Temari's lips pressed together in that not a smile she gave him when he earned it. Shion looked ready to be offended, then curious despite herself. What if asking is not enough? She said. Then we argue, Naruto said. And I try to win nice. Shion looked at Kakashi. Does he always speak like that? Only when he's awake, Kakashi said cheerfully. They walked through a country that had been carved with knives. Black basalt cliffs rising like the spine of a sleeping beast, grass crouched low against a wind that didn't trust promises. Hinata kept the world mapped under her skin like a lantern turned inward. Naruto felt the low thrum underfoot the way he had on the bridge, a slow heartbeat under rock. If dragon loads were real, this was one, power-pooled where the world had learned to look up. Bandits tried the usual mistake at the second ridge. Only these wore sea glass beads and had phrases burned scarred into their forearms, serpents biting their tails. Tiamat cult, Karen murmured, sensor sense prickling. Lots of borrowed bravado. Borrowed from who? Naruto asked. Something down a well, she said. Something that wants to be a sea. The fight was quick. Temari's fan foe. LDED 2 men off a cliff with a gust they would remember as a miracle if they survived. Hinata took a leader's wrist and turned a knife into an apology. Naruto burned a charm that tried to siphon Shio's warmth through her skin and didn't let it have a say. Shion did not hide behind anyone. She placed herself where her presence made the men hesitate and used that hesitation like a rope. When the last of them stumbled away, she watched them go with an expression that was not cruelty and not pity. They wanted to give themselves to an easy god, she said. I've met easy gods, Naruto said. They always come with math that says other people should pay for your salvation. Shion looked at him then as if the prophecy in her head had decided to add a new column. The shrine crowned a bluff like a stubborn thought. Stone steps, narrow and numerous, climbed in a spine. Bells chimed without wind. The guardians at the gate wore lacquered masks that made eye contact a chore. They bowed to Shion and to the scroll sealed at her wrist. They sniffed at Naruto and decided to have patience about it. Inside, foxfire burned along the ribbed corridors, willows of light dangling from chains, casting green over red pillars and ink-black floors you could see yourself in even if you didn't like the view. The air was clean in the way of places that had told dust it wasn't allowed. Shion made them leave air sandals at a threshold etched with old script. The vault is below, she said. It keeps things we don't let out, and it asks questions. What kind? Temari asked. The kind that tastes like honesty. Shion's glance cut to Naruto. If you lie, you leave. Possibly as smoke. Karen looked delighted. Finally, she said, a test that hates most people. They descended. The stairs pinched toward each other until shoulder brushed shoulder and the sound of your own breath had to make room for the sound of everyone else's. Naruto felt the pressure change. Air became something that had weight. The stone around them hung. At the foot, a door without hinges waited. It had been carved out of the same rock as the passage, then told to forget that. Shion pressed 2 fingers to a small square near the edge and spoke a word that tasted like an old debt being settled. The door listened and slid aside. The vault wasn't a room. It was a drop. A shaft speared the earth, lit by strands of foxfire that fell like slow rain. Platforms jutted from the walls in irregular steps, connected by ribs of stone that made their own rules about gravity. In the center hung a bell the size of a house, suspended from nothing. Its surface etched with sigils that made Hinata's Byakugan squint. Vertical labyrinth, Temari said, warming to it. For once a plan respects my fan. Shion's mouth twitched, almost amused. The vault asks tourists to leave and supplicants to think. It asks kings to kneel. Her eyes flicked to Naruto. It will ask you that. It is not a request. Good thing I'm not a king, he said lightly. Kakashi's eye smiled. Then you'll have fewer crown neck problems to report. They stepped out onto the first rib of stone. Wind lifted immediately, fresh as a river mouth. Naruto could feel currents running like chalk marks, showing arrows only he and the wind cared about. Truth of wind wasn't a voice, it was a vector. They started down. The first trial was stingy, a ledge that narrow, ed to a line and a gap too far for normal legs. You could crawl and risk being slow, or jump and risk the angle. Naruto went last, letting Hinata plot footwork with small, right-sounding words. Temari floated herself on a tease of wind. Karen walked it like she'd spent her life on badly built stairs. Kakashi made the jump while pretending not to, because teaching is a kind of lying we permit. Halfway down, a panel in the wall flared and sang a map in foxfire letters. Shion paused and frowned. We don't light that unless. A tremor ran through the shaft, not natural. The wind went sideways for a heartbeat. Hinata's breath clipped. Naruto steadied her without making a scene. Temari braced and swore at the physics, which helped. Company, Karen said, and not the polite kind. The polite kind arrived first. Kojiro leaned in the mouth of a balcony cut into stone, the 7 talismans on his vest quiet, like punctuation about to be used later. 2 choir operatives flanked him. Their eyes went right to Naruto. Then to Shion's wrist where the shrine seal glowed. Invitation received, Kojiro said, as if they'd sent it. His gaze tracked the architecture with the professional appreciation of a thief admiring a lock. We prefer to remove dangerous assets without disrespecting their makers. Shion's chin lifted. We don't sell what our dead asked us to keep. We're not buying, Kojiro said, mild. We're preventing your neighbors from being buyers by default. Before Shion could spit a response, another presence arrived behind Kojiro with the hush of a blade sliding into a sheath that fit too well. Lady Benizuru wore black like a theorem, all clean lines and no ornament. A ring the size of a carriage wheel rested upright beside her, etched with patient geometry. Wiring ran from it into a wooden crate the size of a pew. Inside, something pulsed, an engine with a heart you could hear if you knew how to listen badly. Null engine, Benizuru said without flourish, answering the question no one had asked yet. Portable, efficient, community safe in my hands. Her eyes skimmed them and stopped at Naruto with a cool recognition that did not bother pretending to be surprised. You make messes. I clean some up, Naruto said. Sloppy men call that heroism. Benizuru gestured to the pipework coiling toward the shaft like vines. We call that waste. Step aside. We will harvest the vault's hazard and redistribute the risk. You mean take power, Temari said. I mean ensure no single amateur writes laws for air, Benizuru said, flat. Shion, your priests have played at gods for generations. I prefer municipalities. Shion didn't blush. She also didn't move. We don't kneel to your math. Benizuru almost smiled. You will. Everyone does when it is correct. Kojiro cleared his throat without embarrassment. The sound of a man who had tact surgically installed. Benizuru, he said, slow, the vault is threaded with old vows. Your engine anchor's dirty. As if you don't enjoy a challenge, she murmured. And shifted 2 switches. The ring purred. The big bell in the center of the shaft trembled, as if a polite cough were beginning miles below. Foxfire lines glowed on platforms that hadn't lit in decades. Hinata's eyes widened. She is changing the currents. Shion stepped forward. Turn that off. I will, Benizuru said, when it's empty. The trial below began Chan. Jing shape. Ribs of stone unfurling into stairs, then collapsing into chutes, then curving into spiral tracks that looked like fun if you were an avalanche. Kakashi's hand settled on Naruto's shoulder, a reminder disguised as habit. Pick our path, he said. And pick fast. They ran. Temari made wind pillars. Narrow cyclones Naruto could step on without the truth of the world objecting too loudly. Hinata called vectors. Left now. Down 2. Breathe. Karen stayed on Naruto's 6 and pushed ceiling tags against his spine in short taps that said you're at 60%, 55, 50, breathe or I'll stab you. Kakashi yanked a broken plank into place with cable line and a lazy twitch. Shion did not slow them down. She learned their pace and substituted hers where necessary, calling rights by memory that made a bridge appear for exactly 1 second when they needed exactly 1 second. The vault didn't ask riddles. It set choices like forks in bone. At one landing, they found 2 doors, both open. Through the left, a corridor where foxfire burned blue and the air did that slick trick knives do when you touch their edges. Through the right, a trench filled with knee-deep, fluorescent schlee. Me crawling with leeches that looked like punctuation gone wrong. Left is fight, Tamari said immediately. Right is gross. Left is speed, Sasuke would have said if he'd been here. Karen sniffed. Left is sealing traps. Right is poison. Your flame likes poison. Naruto walked right. The leeches latched and hissed and then simply forgot to be leeches when the platinum brushed them. His scales prickled and ached. He kept moving. Teeth grit. Shion watched him choose and said nothing, which felt like the loudest comment she could have made. Another fork. A straight descent lined with bells. Chi would ring if so much as a thought brushed them the wrong way, or a detour through a room where the floor was a grid of tiles labeled with names. Shion's fingernails dug into her palm. These are the dead keepers, she said. If you step on a name, you take their watch. Naruto nodded at the bells and walked the long way. He stepped where there wasn't a name. When that became impossible, he balanced on the line between 2. Breath ticking, wings that weren't wings catching a draft of will. His foot slipped once. Hinata caught his elbow, not to steady him but to remind him his body had weight and permission to use it. They made the far side breathing like polite people. Kojira's voice drifted from a balcony somewhere above, clinical and, weirdly, approving. He picks the cost he's willing to pay. He murmured to someone who didn't answer. Benizuru kept working. The engine's purr rolled toward a growl. Cables glowed. The great bell's rim sang a low note that made Naruto's back teeth ache. They reached the bell floor. Close up. The thing felt less like an object and more like a condensed promise. The sigils etched into its skin didn't read as shinobi seals, they read like resolve hammered flat and made into grammar. The vault's heart. The trial for supplicants was simple there. A dais waited, a platform of clean stone in the middle of a catwalk of rude timber. A small bowl, a knife, old choices, bleed or story or both. Shion stood beside the dais, hair catching foxfire light like threads in silk. If you kneel, she said, you ask for power and promise to be small where you must. If you don't kneel, you leave without waking the bell, and it never trusts you again. So the choice is obey to unlock, or keep your pride and stay dumb, Tamari said. I suddenly like your vault. Shion's eyes cut to her. It's not about pride, it's about posture. We ask those who would take to learn to receive. Hard pass on both the kneeling and the taking, Naruto said. But you want the bell's help. I want to be able to put a roof over people, he said. I don't care if it's called a bell. Shion looked at him, and something complicated moved across her face, like a cloud deciding whether to be shade or rain. She gestured. Then stand there and say your vow. Naruto stepped onto the dais. The bell hummed, polite curiosity. He didn't kneel. He didn't posture. He thought of the bridge and the barrels. Of Gaara's eyes and Temari's voice, of Hinata's fingers tapping a halo seam, of Karen's thumb leaving ink on his skin where he'd tried to live. He focused on the cleanest idea he had. No devouring, he said. Because the vault liked old words, and that one was old. Not by gods or by math. Not by monsters that call themselves ideas. Let people choose. Let me make room for their choices. The bell did not ring. The air did. It shivered around him, then settled, then carried his vow into its own architecture the way a temple folds a prayer into a beam. The foxfire along the shaft brightened, then stayed. Nothing dramatic, nothing showy. Something unlocked. It was small as a breath. He felt it seething into the edges of his light, teaching it a new trick without insisting it was better than the old ones. The world clarified in a radius around him. Benizuru's engine hum dropped 2 notes in his ears. The halo geometry near the lower platforms lost a fraction of its bite. Sanctuary arrived in a way only Naruto could feel at first, a circle he carried that made poisons pretend to be water and illusions forget their actors. He stepped off the dais and the circle moved with him, no flash, no choir. No crown. Okay, he said, trying not to grin and failing. New rule. What is it? Hinata asked, tone light as air and just as attentive. Home, Naruto said. In a bottle. Karen leaned in and breathed the air near his arm like a sommelier sniffing the cork. Her shoulders relaxed a degree. Genjutsu slips off, she confirmed. And the poison in the air here just died of boredom. Tamari tested the edge of the circle with a toe, then stepped in and exhaled like she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. You made weather, she said. I hate it, but I'm using it. Benizuru looked down from her balcony like a woman observing a child discover addition. She adjusted 2 levers. The engine deepened, found grip in the bell's note. Metal cables thrummed. Shion, Kojiro warned, voice losing its politeness. Your foundation is going to detune. Shion's jaw set. Turn it off. We're past a safe reversal, Benizuru said. Which is why one does not experiment with relics without bringing equipment built since warlords stopped having hairstyles. A crack snaked around the bell's rim, hair thin at first, then not. The engine tugged on the promise. In the metal like a fisherman yanking a too big catch into a too small boat. Up, Kakashi said, calm breaking into command. Now, the rest of the shrine moved at once, priests chanting, acolytes SPR. Inting along catwalks with ropes and wedges and faces that looked like they'd trained for earthquakes, not arguments. Naruto stepped and the sanctuary moved with him like a shadow you could choose. A low mist rolled off the circle. Lazy bandages for the air. Where it touched, Benizuru's influence fuzzed. The engine complained in a way only Kojiro and Hinata seemed to hear. Right, Tamari said through her teeth. Fanning wind columns into existence where there were none. Hinata, call me the steps. Naruto, I've got the people, he said, and jumped. Wingstep held without stress this time. Not the panicky one too he had learned on rooftops. A set of careful, repeatable footholds in air, each a polite permission. He skimmed past a sling of falling stones and caught a junior priest by back of his robe before gravity could make theology final. He dropped the boy into Sanctuary's circle. The kid blinked and stopped choking on dust. Run that way, Naruto said, pointing to a stair that was suddenly blessedly clear. Stay in the clean part. Sanctuary, Shion said, almost to herself, translating his stupid phrase into a word the shrine would understand later. The bell cracked louder. Benizuru's operatives were driving braces into the walls to keep the engine steady under load. Kojiro's knuckles went white on a rail that didn't deserve it. Benizuru, he said softly. This collapses cathedrals. Not if we push it through and vent, she said, voice clipped. We'll spit the residue into the upper air. It will dilute and be safe. That's not what this place is tuned for, he said. It will be, she said. Naruto landed on a shrinking platform and felt the world choose a break. There's a moment when a thing that is going to fail tells the room before it tells itself. He looked up, tasted the vector, and didn't ask permission. Tamari, he shouted, Sanctuary streaming behind him like a barely visible banner. Make me stairs. She didn't waste breath asking if he was serious. Wind hammered pillars into a spine up and up, just enough for feet that didn't mind cheating. He ran, Sanctuary brushing priests who stopped coughing and started counting. Hinata called angles and notches, 1 2 3. Keep going, head duck, left, no, you're left. Kakashi dragged Shion away from a board that had pretended to be a walkway and then retired from the attempt to keep everyone equally alive. Triaging on the fly with the kind of economy you only get after a few wars teach you all the wrong lessons. The bell's crack reached the center and stopped pretending to be hairline. The engine pulled. The bell complained. The vault shifted 1 degree toward catastrophe. Naruto turned on the last wind stare. The engine's face made him want to punch equations. He saw the way it's Ines promised to flatten everything they touched into a manageable pattern and never once asked who wanted to live under that. Fine, he said to the air, to the bell, to a woman who believed in weekdays. To a boy he used to be who would have tried to break this with his forehead. We go up. World Shield wasn't a wall this time. It was a ramp aimed at the sky. He placed it with the same strange paw. RT of himself that had used it in the stadium, angling its face so force would run along it instead of through. Then he did something rude. He reached for the bell and tugged. Not to help the engine, not to harvest. To misalign the failure. To put the messy end somewhere it would break clouds instead of bones. The vault bucked. The ring in his pocket screamed like a tuning fork. Hinata staggered and caught herself, palms slapping stone. Karen grabbed Naruto's collar from behind as if he were a kite and she the string. The bell tore. It didn't shatter beyond repair. It shed a skin, a bright skin. A membrane of promise that the engine tried to swallow and choked on. The world bent toward the angle Naruto had made. The tear in the air rolled up the ramp he'd set and roared into the shaft above, found the sky. And wrote a new hole in a cloud big enough to teach weather humility. Wind sucked. Foxfire flickered and then steadied. The engine convulsed as a man does when pride leaves, then coughed. The purr died. Benizuru cut power with a hand that tried not to shake. Kojiro let go of the rail. The vault held. Naruto did not. The scales along his chest and shoulders cracked in a spiderweb. Then opened like 1,000 small mouths howling pain. For a second he saw nothing but white. Then he was on his knees on a platform he had no memory of reaching. Hinata's hands were on his face and see. All are bone in the precise places you touch when you know which nerves go where. Karen was saying his name in a tone that implied she was not fond of funerals. Tamari stood over them with her fan planted like a standard, daring falling debris to call her bluff. Kakashi looked too calm, which meant he was not calm. Breathe, Hinata said, and he did, because people who say it like that make it a command your body respects. When Frame and Flame stopped disagreeing about who was in charge, Naruto realized they'd moved. Sanctuary still spun around them, its small, stubborn climate refusing to recognize someone else's emergency. It carried the smell of clean stone and wind and the faintest hint of ramen from his clothes because your personal weather is petty like that. The trick of it settled into him. Not a thing he wore. A thing he carried. Shion knelt a pace away, her eyes on the bell like a mother watching a child survive a fever the village had said would end differently. She glanced at Naruto once, long, as if measuring his height on a doorframe. Then she stood and leveled her gaze at Benizuru. You will leave now, she said, no ritual in it. Benizuru looked at the engine, then at the bell's bright scar. She slid her hand over the case with the big halo and made a decision with her fingers. We will, she said. For today. Kojira's mouth tugged as if he agreed with two incompatible statements at once. He gave Naruto the lightest nod. Your ramp was elegant, he said, which is a thing a man like him can call a compliment. Don't tell your boss, Naruto said. She will charge me. She will, Kojira said, deadpan. They withdrew. Benizuru's operatives folded the engine like a sullen animal that had remembered obedience. The choir left nothing but quietly offended air. The vault stopped humming like a choir itself and went back to being a bell that could keep secrets. They climbed in the wake of quiet. At the shrine's open galleries, evening had turned gold into something warmer. Priests swept with tired grace. The wind moved as if it had learned to be gentle. Shion found them a balcony that the temple kept for people who had almost died. The rail was painted red. He see tens of meters below pretended not to be cruel. Over the water, a slit of sunset burned in a color sugared with ash. Hinata stood at the rail with him. She didn't touch his hand. She let her older lightly touch his upper arm like a metronome marking living. For a while they said nothing and listened to the bird wingbeats of swallows darting at dusk. You didn't kneel, she said finally, and he heard no accusation in it. Only curiosity, quiet as a lantern. I asked nicely, he said. Then it asked me. I said no. Then it asked me better. I still said no, because I didn't want to pretend kneeling made the rule real. He groped for words. I want to kneel to people when they need me to. Hinata's laugh was small and genuine, and luckier people than Naruto had lived on less for years. That sounded less noble in your head, she said gently. Way less, he agreed. I'm a disaster at frescoes. You're good at roofs. She leaned out over the rail until his hand hovered without touching in case gravity got fresh. You knew where to send the brake. I guessed and then lied to the sky until it believed me, he said. Don't do that often, she said it mildly, like a general reminding a captain about bullets. Her eyes, their clear, steady light, turned on him, searching for a thing you can't see on skin. How bad? He shrugged one shoulder and immediately regretted it, his breath hitched as the cracked scales under his shirt chimed soft pain. He didn't lie. Bad. We will make it less so, she said. Together. The word together anchored something, not big enough to break the balcony. Big enough to change a posture. He wanted to say too much. He didn't. He let the silence keep the rest because silence can be kind when you give it instruction. Later, Xian found him in a corridor of ink-dark floor. Her bare feet making no sound. She carried a small wooden box that looked older than some wars. The vault chose you, she said, and you refused to kneel. You forced it to respect you anyway. I didn't force anything, he said. We met in the middle. Most who use that phrase mean they stood still until someone else did the walking, Xian said dryly. You bled sideways. That counts. She opened the box. Inside lay a silk-wrapped thing that put chill air into the corridor. A relic, she said. We keep this because when we forget it exists, a town burns. We cannot use it. You won't either. But if someone tries to make you choose for them, show them this and say you already did. Naruto looked at the wrapped weight and didn't touch it. I don't want a doomsday, he said. It's a mirror, Xian said. The kind that shows you what you are when you threaten a stranger. Her mouth flattened almost into a smile. The prophecy said you'd die here if you tried to crown yourself. You did not, so I rewrote a line. You can do that, he asked, genuinely delighted. Of course, she said. Prophecy is only a schedule. It assumes nobody is brave. What does the new line say? She looked toward the sea and chose whether to be grand. She decided against it. That you're dangerous when you are kind, she said. And that frightens the right people. Night tilted properly darkness. The shrine's bells spoke in short, careful syllables. Naruto couldn't sleep, which is one of the costs of making choices too big for your mattress. He found the roof he always flew. ND in new places. The one with a repair nobody ever fixed perfectly. The one where birds paused, the one where a person could be small above something large. He took Kojira's ring out and rolled it in his palm. It didn't hum. It had done enough humming for one day. Down in the courtyards, acolytes banked foxfire in ceramic jars. The sea pressed itself against rock with the stubbornness of religion. The wind had stopped behaving entirely and wanted to become a song. He hurt. He wasn't ashamed of it. He liked being alive more than he disliked pain. He knew before the alarms that something had come wrong. It started as a cold in the air the sanctuary couldn't warm, a new pressure that wasn't gravity and wasn't weather and wasn't a person. His scales prickled, the cracked ones protesting. He stood before his body asked. Hinata slid out of the shadow like she'd been waiting there on purpose, no explanation, just a nod. Tamari came at speed with her fan half open like a question. Karen jogged up, snapping a seal into her hands and swearing with the efficiency of a professional. Kakashi appeared already rubbing a knuckle against his Sharingan like it had been itching all evening. What? Tamari said. Something that likes knives in circles, Karen said. The first scream didn't come from the shrine. It came from the cliff path below, where a work party of priests had stayed late to wedge supports. The head acolyte's shout warbled into a choke. Naruto vaulted the rail and let the air take him 2 steps at a time. Open sky had been a trick before, underground it had made himself useful, now. Out in honest night above honest sea, it became a verb. He felt the legion of no gravity under his soles, he felt the currents meet him like ropes held by friends. He ran on nothing and then land. Dead on stone and then on nothing again, exactly where he needed to land to see. The serpent was not flesh. It was absence given spine. Water didn't move around it, it opted out. Starlight bent where it should have stitched. 5 heads rose in a crown around a man on the path. Tall, lean, a shinobi's posture starved of kindness. His eyes were normal. That made everything worse. He wore a collar of BL. Acond scale around his throat like a church had tried to own him and failed. The serpent's heads answered very small gestures of his fingers. Xian arrived with guards, stepped onto the path, and saw him. Her face did not break and did not shift. She simply looked. Naraka, she said. He smiled with one side of his mouth. High Priestess. Naruto slid sanctuary between the snake wind and the Peo. Ple like a shield you carry in your blood. The air inside his circle remembered that poison was a choice and refused. The nearest serpent head turned in curiosity, then struck anyway, met the edge, and recoiled like hunger finding a closed door. Naraka watched the recoil with professional interest. Edict, he said, not to Naruto. To the shrine. Interesting. You're with them, Shion said. Not a question, a diagnosis. He shrugged. They fished me up when I was worth a bucket. They taught me to eat before I got eaten. You taught yours to kneel. Liar, she said. We taught ours to choose. Naraka's smile widened. Choosing is a luxury. He lifted a hand, and the serpent rippled in delight. Benizuru's engine had blown a hole in the sky hours ago. The vault's promise had cracked and been peeled. Whatever residue the engine had not properly vented had rolled along the night like a rumor until it found someone with a crown-shaped hunger. It found Naraka. He stepped onto thin air like he'd been waiting his whole life to be rude to gravity and didn't need a rule to do it. The serpents braided themselves into a ramp that held his weight. Naruto felt the light in him flare in offended recognition. The permission he'd earned, this man had stolen. Back, Naruto said over his shoulder without raising his voice. Tamari planted herself beside him anyway. Hinata moved into the space where he would need his steps, plotting vectors already with her breath. Karen pressed a tag against his ribs and said, "Don't be brave with the wrong part," which counted as affection. Choir. Naruto called up to the gallery without looking. "If you're here," Kojiro was. He was not smiling. His talismans hung quiet, hands in sight, body very still, as if the math in front of him had too many variables to pretend certainty. "We do not have the engine," he said, a rare sound of regret bracketed in professional calm. "We have the ring. We're not using it." "Good," Naruto said. "I don't like where it sits." Benizuru appeared at Kojiro's shoulder like a conclusion. She looked at Naraka with the crisp interest of a critic in front of a ruin. "Crowning via recoil," she said. "Vulgar. Effective. Your lesson was good," Naraka said. "You taught the bell where to crack." "Not for you," she said, as if correcting someone's dinner order. Naraka flexed 2 fingers. The nearest serpent head struck at the balcony. Kojiro flicked a talisman and the mouth closed on empty concept. Benizuru dropped half a ring without releasing it and the coil recoiled as if it had been stung by a rule. "Shion," Naruto said, because the priestess stood in the wrong place for someone with a target on her soul. She stepped back without losing dignity. Naraka's eyes slid to Naruto, took inventory, found the sanctuary in the parasitic hunger of the cracked scales and the way Naruto's stance said not that today. "You're the one with the vow," he said. "I've heard of you. I've heard worse things about myself," Naruto said. "Welcome to the balcony." Naraka cocked his head. "Do you know what crowns are for?" "To make necks hurt," Naruto said. "Wrong," Naraka said softly, and when he smiled then he wasn't handsome. "They're for devouring in public." He moved. The serpent head spoke with one voice at last. Absence rushed with shape. Temari's first blast folded the closest 2 heads into each other, which should have been impossible and offended reality enough to make the strike M-Island. Hinata called him right, then left, then punched a seam in the serpent's breath with a point of her fingers that made Naruto's sanctuary flare to cover an opening. Karen yelled, 30%, which meant Naruto's overburn line was closer than his ego wanted. Naraka came down the braided ramp and met Naruto in the circle. And the absence hissed at the presence. He touched the edge of sanctuary with a boot and smiled without mirth. "Neat," he said. "Try it on a city." "Pass," Naruto said, and meant it and Naraka heard that he meant it. And something in his expression briefly considered envy and abandoned it. He tried to break Naruto's circle the way a shore tries to kill a lighthouse, by eroding. Naruto fed it. "Why? Oh, you don't defend a circle by thickening it until it pops. You defend it by making it bigger than it has a right to be." He stepped forward, and the edge of sanctuary moved. Poison tried to be polite and gave up. Genjutsu wrote itself a little apology and left. "Kojiro," Benizuru said without warmth, "if you have a better idea then, watch this, speak it." "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight we see if he boy's law is bigger than the woman's cleverness." "Rude," she said. "Accurate." Naraka's ramp ran out of sky within sanctuary's radius. He made more out of absence. Naruto made less with a look and a step. It wasn't spectacle. It was 2 men arguing with air while 3 friends moved wind and vectors and seals like fingers moving on a piano you play because your house is loud and you need the song to be louder. It was small and big. It was stupid and precise. Naraka's hand came in at Naruto's collarbone and tried to lay a law there, the kind that says kneel. Naruto's light met it with King's dew, and the ambient tyranny sagged for exactly the kind of second that wins fights and saves lives. Naruto didn't punch. He reached past the collarbone and found the shoulder, the place you put AH. And when you want someone to stop fighting themselves long enough to hear you. He shoved. You don't get to eat people to feel tall, he said. Naraka's laugh had never learned to like company. Watch me. He didn't go for Naruto then. He reached for the shrine. The serpent unbraided and plunged for the bell hanging over open air, the bright scar the engine had made, the place where faith had been thinned and was still settling. If the snake got there, it would drink the residue, and the night would grow teeth. Naruto moved. World shield snapped in place, tilted up, already chewing on force like a patient mill. The serpent hit and slid, shredding itself into vapor that reassembled 10 meters away and tried again. Naruto's whole body sang pain into a kind of music he could survive. Karen's ha. ND thumped his back. 40, and he could hear the fear under the numbers. Hinata's voice guided his right foot onto nothing that held and then onto stone. Tamari threw wind into the angled path to make the redirect cleaner. And the serpent howled like absence, discovering a new thing called frustration. Overhead, the sky cracked again, a long thin wound that wasn't weather. But the redirection held, and the shrine didn't break. Naraka lifted 2 fingers to his lips like a man whistling for a dog. The serpent's heads reoriented midair and converged on the one place Naruto couldn't cover, the easy, stupid place, his friends. He made a choice that did not feel noble and did not look clever. He turned his back on Naraka and stepped over Tamari, over Hinata, over Karen, sanctuary rising like I'd that only cared about the people you could fit your arms around. The serpent struck the edge and stopped, absence arguing with presence and losing not because it was weak but because it met a room with a lock on it. Naraka lowered his hand and smiled, because now the king had done a king thing where everyone could see and Adam Smith himself could write essays about it. Predictable, he said. Safe, Naruto said. That's the word. Night tore itself around the edges of the fight. The serpent began learning their tricks. The balcony splintered under blows that should not have made wood break. K and Les Wood heard the argument and decided to be helpful. Kakashi's hand was on Naruto for a second, then on Shion, then gone, the man doing the unglamorous parts of war that let boys write laws in air. Benizuru watched, calculating. Kojiro had his palm on a pillar, listening to the building decide what to do. Shion had stopped telling men what to do and started telling the shrine what it ought to remember about itself. Naraka, she said softly, when the fight paused to breathe the way all fights do. You survived a famine. They taught you hunger as a god. You could say no. I did, he said. And his smile turned honest all at once, awful and clean. I said no to dying small. Naruto said, try living small. I don't have time, Naraka said, and meant it. He raised his arms. The serpent, she writhed into a single spear of silence. Naruto met it with everything he'd learned since a rain-soaked clearing. He planted World Shield, then layered Sanctuary against it to keep the wrong things fr. Own riding the reflected blast back into the crowd. He opened himself too much. He felt cracks widen in his scales not just at the edges now but through the center, and the light snarled in pain in that made him almost say sorry out loud. Tamari shoved wind under his elbow. Hinata pressed 2 fingers to a nerve in his forearm that made the pain curve. Karen swore at him like a poem and slap. A wrathful green tag between his shoulder blades that wicked heat into its paper until steam rose. The spear hit the angle and screamed up, split a cloud, burned a new hole in a sky that was starting. To feel personally victimized by Konoha teenagers. The serpent uncoiled and hissed as if something had taken a bite out of its arrogance. Naraka didn't flinch. He looked at Naruto through the bendo. Air the world shield made and tilted his head. Okay, he said, gracious as a prince acknowledging a duel. That was a king's answer. He lifted his hand a fraction. The serpent flowed back to him, pet and weapon. He stepped back ceremoniously onto a midair stone like he owned it. Shion's guards arrived with desperate faces and bows they didn't know how to use in air. Benizuru tapped a talisman against her forearm once, twice. Enough, she said, as if to herself. We are not culling a city tonight. Naraka smiled as if they had scheduled a second course. Not tonight, he conceded. His eyes flicked to Naruto. The look wasn't contempt. It was promise. You looked up when you could have looked down. Good. I'll teach you what crowns are for. He turned. The serpent folded around him like a boat and slid into the dark along the seam in the sky as if absence could become a door. The shriek of air closing behind it sounded like a lid on a pot. Silence reassembled very slowly, molecule by molecule. The shrine's bells found themselves and struck twice, very soft, as if apologizing for a conversation they hadn't meant to overhear. Temari lowered her fan and rolled her shoulder to hear it complain. Hinata stepped into Naruto's line of sight and held his gaze until his breath matched hers again. Karen leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder and then pretended she'd meant to check his temperature. Kojiro slid down the last of the steps and stood with them. He looked at Naruto for a long breath as if someone had given him two data sets that did not reconcile and he had decided to like the discord. Your friend is right, he said, nodding at Karen. You're not allowed to burn the crown to keep your hands warm. Naruto managed a laugh that sounded like a bruise getting over itself. I'm still learning what part is crown. Good, Kojiro said. He looked up at Benizuru, who was already writing a report in her head. We'll clean the mess we can clean. We will write a better engine, she said coolly. One that vents responsibly. Shion made a very small, very impolite sound the shrine's acoustics magnified into elegance. Or you will accept that some engines have no business existing. Benizuru did not grace that with an answer. She and Kojiro left with their operatives, and the shrine's air untensed by degrees. Later, when the adrenaline had leaked out and left only weight, Shion found Naruto again. She had rewritten something inside herself and it made her look easier. I changed the prophecy, she said without preamble. You don't die here, you make a roof. He wanted to make a joke about writing credits and then didn't, because you don't make jokes in rooms where someone has finally used their office to be kind. Thank you, he said simply. She nodded once. Make it large enough for strangers. I am, he said. It's the only kind worth building. Hinata was already waiting on the balcony with 2 cups of tea, one for him, one to warm her hands around. She passed his over without looking at him because sometimes intimacy is not eye contact, it's the gift of not making you perform. He took it. The steam softened the cracked smell of his scales and made the night less clinical. Tomorrow, she said, we go to Kumo. How did you know? He asked. Kojiro left a note with Kakashi, she said, a smile tucked under the words. They want to talk about airspace ethics. Of course they do, he said. He sipped and winced and smiled because pain and relief occupy the same shelf sometimes. Far offshore, thunder rolled politely, as if asking permission in advance. He leaned on the rail until his ribs announced their continued presence, and then he didn't lean. Hinata's shoulder touched his again. The shrine behind them breathed. The world held. Somewhere along the coast, a man with a borrowed crown looked into a hole in the sky and imagined cities. Somewhere else, a woman filed a report that read like good governance and felt like ambition. Somewhere else, a boy who had refused to kneel rubbed the cracked scales on his chest and did not apologize for wanting to keep people. He watched stars come back through the tears they'd made in the clouds and thought, not of the fight, but of roofs. He had a feeling he'd need a bigger one. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. King in the Open Sky. Kumogakure's council hall had been built like an apology to mountains, wide windows carved straight into granite, a view that made people feel honest by accident. Flags leaned in the breeze. The table in the center was long enough for grudges. Naruto stood at the window and watched the village breathe. Roofs cheered like armor up the slopes. Clouds dragged their sleeves along ridgelines. Somewhere below, training fields clattered. Hinata traced the location of watchtowers on a paper map with one fingertip, not looking at her hand, seeing through it. Temari pretended her fan wasn't leaning against a polished pillar like a smug third wheel. Karen sat back. Kay Ward in a chair nursing a cup of something that looked medicinal and smelled like an argument with mint. Shion's white robes had gathered Kumo dust and didn't apologize. The first sound of the meeting. G was a door thunking with the weight of a woman who carried heat wherever she went. Yugito Ni entered in a neat coat and a gaze that measured. She bowed just enough to be polite to people she didn't owe. You're the dragon boy, she said to Naruto, as if she were reciting from a menu she didn't trust yet. Sometimes, he said, mostly roof repair. Her mouth twitched. You'll fit here. She introduced the others with spare precision. A trio of Kumo captains with the competent boredom of people who solve problems early, a counselor whose silver hair had outlived 5 mistakes and 1 marriage. 2 civilian representatives who wore their practicality like armor. Kakashi sat at the far end of the table with that unnerving comfort he had anywhere numbers gathered. He raised a hand. Thank you for agreeing to this summit. We prefer not to host apocalypses without consent, Yugito said dryly. Let's talk airspace. And whatever walked out of that seam in the sky over the land of demons. Name's Naraka, Naruto said. He builds with holes. Karen put her cup down. He absorbs, devours, the stuff your temples write warnings about. And the Sable Choir? The counselor asked, voice careful. Are they invited? Invited to listen, Tamari said. She didn't have to wait long to find out. Kojiro was already there when the guards checked the rafters again, a professional trick of apiary. Exactly when you decide you don't want someone to appear. He lifted his palms the way you do when entering a kitchen where you're not family. Consent requested, he said. We come as observers. His eyes flicked to Naruto and Hinata. And as people who prefer roofs to crowns. Yugito's gaze cut to the side gallery. We'll allow it, but if your ring eats one of my ceilings, I feed you to the cats. Kojiro inclined his head, unimpressed by threats or perhaps impressed in a private way. Duly noted. They started with maps. Sheehan traced a circle on the parchment around the sea trench where E. Shrine's prophecies said old things turned in their sleep. Currents have shifted, she said. Someone is dredging the dark. Someone, Tamari said, who is very proud of his fishing net. Not a net, Kojiro said. A crown. Benizuru arrived the way good excuses do, on time, composed. Kojiro's eyes tightened the width of a hair. She wore an austere jacket and a face that asked what is the minimum necessary to make you rational. She inclined her head to the council, precise respect, not one heartbeat extra, and placed a slim case on the table. We brought documentation on the engine incident a proposed moratorium on live null deployments within 2 kilometers of inhabited structures, she said. Also, a design for a civic oversight board. We call it the Airspace Accord. She slid papers with the serenity of a dealer. We are not here to conquer the sky. We are here to keep anyone else from doing it alone. By doing it first, Naruto said. By writing procedure, she corrected. The distinction saves lives. Yugito took a paper and didn't pretend to read more than 3 lines. If something eats the sky, is there a page for that? Benizuru's fingers rested on the case. Memos for lower officers. Something older for the board. Shien's glance at Naruto said. This is the sort of woman who can make a trap look like policy. Naruto didn't disagree. He also didn't ignore what it meant to bring policy to a fight. The windows darkened without clouds. It didn't happen like weather. It happened like a hand over a lamp. Naruto felt the pressure before the light changed. His scales prickled under their careful ink. His bones attentive. Hinata's head lifted, Byakugan opening without ceremony. Karen turned her cup into a weapon without setting it down. Naraka, Shien said, barely above a breath. The floor hummed. The glass became a gray mouth. Then the first of the serpent's 5 heads pressed itself against the window from the outside like a prank with gravity. A line of abs. Enses carved the air behind it, everything bending around what wasn't there. Move, Yugito said to the room, and no one had to be told twice. The head struck. The window learned to shatter. Naruto didn't wait to be a spectator. He grabbed the nearest captain by the collar and shoved him clear and then put his palm out into the spray of glass and night. Sanctuary rose like a tide. The shards hit and fell out of interest. The serpent's breath rolled around the circle and came away thinner. Naraka stepped through air as if down a civic stair, boots crunching on the last of the window without asking. He had added something new to himself. A collar of scale that wasn't metal or mortal. Black-green, oil slick, etched from inside by pale veins of hunger. Tiamat's touch made a mask over his grin. A church that had eaten the congregation. City looks good in moonlight, he said, and he meant ruin. Leave, Yugito said, voice steady. Or learn how polite we can be with blue fire. Naraka's eyes fell. Ick to her like he was moving down a list of amusements. Matabi's vessel, he said. I've been curious. Curiosity kills, she said, and the air around her warmed in a color that made the room's corners stand straighter. Blue flames laced her shoulders, fanning out in slow, self-respecting arcs. Naruto felt their heat hitch. His own flame tasted it and found a rhythm that wasn't the same and wasn't jealous. Everyone outside, Kakashi said, because rooms are bad places for the wrong arguments. The council emptied like water down a sensible drain. The terrace outside the hall opened on a drop, white stone steps, then rooftops. Then the gulf of Kumo's air. Bells below started yelling without waiting for instruction. Yugito moved first, blue fire sketching controlled ellipses around her hands. Naruto broke open his light without spectacle, platinum brightening the air between them to a clean temperature. Temari took the height and made a shear in the wind that turned the serpent's first lunge into a sideways smear. Hinata stood 3 paces behind Naruto, already calling vectors in a voice only he needed to hear. Karen slapped tags on his spine and ribs with the unapologetic intim. ACY of a medic who owns you during fights. Shion stood on the lip of the terrace and laid a hand on the stone, asking it to remember. Kojiro didn't draw his ring. He drew breath like a man deciding who he is in public. Benizuru adjusted her cuff. 3 operatives unfolded like careful answers behind her. Choir, she said. Civilian corridors first. Block the fall lines. This is not containment. This is evacuation. A grin almost vibrated Naruto's mouth. Policy, he said. Procedure, Benizuru corrected, and then her eyes cut to Naraka. And prosecution. Naraka stepped off the terrace, and absence made a staircase. The 5 heads braided and unbraided, each mouth a different hunger. He did not come alone. The air around him frothed with hundreds of small serpents, wrenched off the seams in the world like weeds, slender, fast. Starved. Kumo's alarms found their pitch. Runners bolted along roof ropes. Squad captains barked names and got answers. High atop a spire, a taiko drum started hitting the sky with belief. Keep the spill off the lower tiers, Yugito said, and her blue fire poured into a curve that wanted to be a shield and turned out to be a wall. It met Naruto's world shield, at an angle he didn't know until his body knew it. Together the 2 surfaces ate the first great strike and sent it skidding high into the air, carving a clean gap in a cloud the shape of an almost smile. The recoil shook Naruto back a step, then 2. His scales complained in neat, electrical sentences. 30%, Karen said. Copy, he said. The serpent's small fry went for the streets. Naruto stepped and sanctuary drowned them without killing. They didn't die so much as forget their purpose and dissolve. Shion widened his circle with a murmur, not to make it grand but to make it precise. Temari used the slipstream the world shield made to scatter a cluster of heads that had braided themselves into a battering ram. Hinata watched pressure lines tighten and snapped a warning, 2 left. Hi, and Naruto planted a palm in nothing and let Wingstep be honest about what it was, a cheat that saved buildings. Naraka smiled thinly at the defensive ballet. He lifted his collar with 2 fingers and the serpent grew thorns on its spine. Each thorn snapped into a miniature halo. Benizuru's geometry, bent and ugly. They spun toward the rooftops. Benizuru's jaw tightened. Counter geometry, she said through her teeth. And her operatives, already on the move, threw talismans that popped the thorns midair with small, efficient snaps. Kojiro leapt from parapet to parapet, wrists a blur of practiced motions. Every ring that might have become a prison died instead as bored metal. 40, Karen said. You owe me a week of naps. Make it 2, Naruto said, and tasted iron behind his tongue. He wanted to roar. He didn't. Ancestral roar steadies allies and staggers monsters, it also rattles civilians. He picked his moments like a miser picks coins. A head lunged for the market street. Naruto turned the world shield to catch it and yelled, not a word, a sound like standing your ground. The roar buried itself in the serpent's mouth like a wedge, the head faltered, Yugito's fire row. A blue line across its snout that made even absence remember heat. Again, Yugito said, we ride your angle. They found a rhythm. The kind you don't talk about later because talking would turn it into a trick. Naruto tilted. Yugito burned. Temari knifed wind into joints the serpent didn't like admitting it had. Hinata's voice walked Naruto's feet through the three-dimensional grid like a guide taking a friend through a crowd. Karen kept him from paying in blood what he could pay in sweat. She unsteadied the stone under all of it like a hand you forget you're holding. Naraka's eyes were busy. He tasted the coordination with an expression that mixed contempt and appreciation. You made a choir, he said to Naruto. Cute. Naruto pointed at the streets where choir operatives routed civilians. At Kojiro steering a falling spire with talismans like thread, at Benizuru snapping a ring into a barricade that wasn't a prison. So did you, he said. We can share a word. Naraka's smile turned knife. Let's not. He reached down with his off hand and flexed. The 5 heads doubled. The serpent became a crown proper. 10 mouths, each speaking hunger into a different street. This time some of the smaller snakes dodged sanctuary's edge, learned its pace, slipped past to bite at eaves and flags. Rooftop 3, Hinata called. Near the bell tower. Naruto couldn't be in both places. He moved anyway. Wingstep stuttered. The air held when it shouldn't have, perhaps because he had asked it too many times and had started to ask better. He landed on the bell tower with one hand and a knee. And burned a ring of clean air around a cluster of small heads that had begun to gnaw at the supports. They came apart like bad ideas when someone asks a good question. Down on the terrace, Naraka laughed once, real loud. Delighted at the chase. Then he went for the heart of the village. He aimed at the assembly square where people were deciding whether to run or to stand. He aimed at the unfashionable middle, the place without flags, where bread waits out the day in baskets. He aimed at consent. Naruto saw it happen as a series of lines. The pressure in the air going wrong, the serpent's spin. E-shaping a spear not for bodies but for will. Tiamat's law wanted to root in the square and tell everyone there they were small. No, Naruto said, and the word hit him like a conclusion. He had been careful with edicts. He had learned to earn them in choices, not in speeches. This one wasn't a vow he'd wanted to make because it would cost too much. He had to make it anyway. Let all who choose the sky be free. He didn't shout it. He placed it. It slid into the air like a nail finds wood. The world tuned around it, just a fraction. Consent, stubborn, private, human, found a seam to stand in. Serpent's law hit that seam and skidded like it had run into a word it couldn't twist. Naruto felt the edict take because it hurt. Not like a crack, like a set bone. Platinum flared up the arch of H's back and spat sparks that tasted like the bell in the shrine. His knees shook. His hands steadied. 50, Karen said, and now there was a thread of wonder snuck under the triage. In the square, something ordinary happened. People chose. A baker stepped in front of his stall instead of under it. A mother grabbed her kid and did not bolt because her bad knee said no. She stood and dared the street to move her. A genin who had failed twice lifted a broom in a stance that was ridiculous and perfect. Hinata watched the change not with eyes but with that other thing that sees. She smiled, small and fierce. The serpent drove again. The edict found more ankles to hold. Consent is slow, then fast. Naraka's face, for one breath, had envy in it, clean, painful, true. Bigger, Yugito said to Naruto between strikes. Make it bigger. I can't make anyone choose, he said, and felt the edges of the law tighten with that truth. I can only make room. Then make room, Tamari snapped. We'll fill it. He did. He stepped forward and the circle moved with him. Sanctuary at the skin, world shield humming in his hands, the new edict upholding wildly specific freedom, only where a person said, even silently, I am not kneeling. It was picky. It was perfect. Kojiro landed beside Benizuru on the low edge of a roof where their bodies made a line between the fighting and the fleeing. He watched the square's hinge point. Watched the way small decisions collected like rain and then became weather. This is your board, he said abruptly. Benizuru didn't look aside from the serpent even as she flicked a talisman to sever a thorn ring. We don't write policy on boys. We write it for villages, he said. And sometimes the boy is carrying one. The serpent realized it could not claim the square and turned honest. It tried to kill instead. 10 heads drew back, mouths wide, absence turning into a hammer. Naruto, Hinata said, quiet as breath and sharp as glass. Up, he went up. Open sky had been a stumble, then a trick, then a verb. Now it was a place. He let the wind gather under his feet and didn't fight it, he rode. The city fell away. A gray chessboard, lights like eyes, bells like pulse. The serpent reared beneath him. A black wreath grown too big for any head. He planted both hands in the air and shaped the world shield at an angle so clean it felt like good carpentry. Yugito, he yelled. On you, she replied. Blue fire brigaded along his ramp like water buckets passing hand to hand, each arc catching the next. Temeri's wind spline stitched the arc into a cleaner curve. Heenit. A's voice drew the path in 3 syllables he didn't know and somehow understood. Sheehan knelt on the terrace and found the village's old oath in the stone and pressed it like a stamp under their feet. The serpent hit. The angles sang. The fire raced. The redirected blast ripped the cloud roof off the night, and for a heartbeat Kuma was under bright, honest sky. The serpent broke. Not destroyed. Nothing that old goes away all at once. It came apart where it had been greedily braided together. Its crown fell inward, thinned, snarled. Naraka flicked his fingers and tried to summon it back obedient. It didn't come neat. Consent had tightened around too many ankles. He landed on a rooftop across from Naruto as if the village had drawn a line between them and asked them to use it. His chest rose and fell hard, not vanity. Body telling on him. The collar around his throat glowed sickly. You will run out, he said. You are buying time with bone. Naruto tasted blood and salt and the thin sweet ness of rice someone had left on an altar 10 streets over. I always am, he said. The point is who gets it. Naraka's mouth flattened. He looked past Naruto at the square, at the way people were making small, stupid stands that added up to a shape no crown enjoys. He looked up at the ripped open sky, the hole they'd made, the harm and the gift both. He looked at Naruto's hands, the angle they held, the bruise blooming under one collarbone in the neat shape of a medic's thumb. You're dangerous when you're kind, he said, and of all the things he could have put in his voice, he chose honesty. So am I. He raised his hand to call the serpent down for a last, senseless strike that would trade 50 lives for a point he didn't need. Benizuru's voice cut across the roofs like a blade. Choir. Kojira's operatives, who had been doing the ugly miracle of evacuation for 20 minutes without asking for a trumpet, changed shape mid-run. Talismans snapped in an angle Naruto hadn't seen them use, a net that wasn't a prison. A geometry that hugged impact and softened it. They ran to where the strike would be and turned physics sideways. Kojira himself moved like a man stepping out of a job description. He landed between Naraka and the square and did not draw a weapon. He lifted both hands. Enough, he said. We are not your arena. Naraka's eyes narrowed at the defection. And you are not my judge. Correct, Kojira said. I'm a citizen. The strike didn't happen. Naraka lowered his hand because it wouldn't mean anything now except proving he could be petty. He hated being petty. He lived for large, clean, awful gestures. The night had run out of those. He looked back at Naruto. For a heartbeat something boy-shaped shifted under the scale. You looked up when you could have looked down, he said again. And this time it sounded almost weary. We will do this where there's only sky next time. Pass, Naruto said, and Naraka's laugh was a crack in a cliff. I'll make you learn to like crowns, he said. And then the serpent folded around him like a door. The seam he had been using writhed. It did not close. It, tired. He vanished into it anyway, not clean, not theatrical, just gone. Like a man stepping into weather. Silence tried to figure itself out. It failed at first and became cheering because that's what relief has available. Then it learned. It became laughter in pieces. And the sound of people counting their bodies and finding them again. Somewhere, a baker sat down on the stones and cried for exactly 11 seconds, then got up and started sweeping because bread doesn't sell itself. Naruto hovered 3 feet off the terrace because his legs had decided no. Hinata reached up and touched his ankle, the lightest pressure, and the air made a small, honest decision. He stepped down and did not fall over. Karen put her palm flat against his chest and frowned at the crack web under her ink. 60, she said, softer for the first time. Okay, he said, and only then did he notice his hands shaking. Yugito's flames withdrew into her like a tide into a deep bay. She rolled her neck and walked to the edge. The village below looked back up at her with a broken window's courage. She lifted one hand. Not grand, palm up. You did good, she told the roofs. She turned to Naruto. Your flame doesn't fight mine, she said. It listens. Mine's nosy, he said. It likes learning, she snorted. It likes consent. She extended her hand, and he took it, and blue fire and platinum got acquainted like old dogs sniffing. If you're ever in Kumo and the sky won't listen, call me. Deal, he said, with the sincerity you save for useful people. Benizuru packed her case with tiny decisions. Kojiro stood very still, like a man at the top of a hill deciding which village to walk down into. Around them the choir operatives were being thanked in a language they didn't usually hear. A child in a too-big coat hugged one around the waist with the violent gratitude. Uday of someone who has never seen that uniform stay only helpful. The operative froze, then patted the kid's head and went bright red. Benizuru, the counselor said. About the board, we will have it by morning, she said smoothly. County signed with Kumo and Konoha and any shrine that can stand under it. Kojira's head turned a fraction. She never promised easily. He looked at Naruto, then at Hinata, then at the square. He exhaled. The arrest can wait, he said quietly to Naruto, which was so bizarrely courteous it made Naruto blink. But the vote can't. What arrest? Naruto asked. She and Jay oined them with the look of a priest who had stopped letting ritual decide. For the engine in the shrine, she said. For endangerment and trespass and a dozen cruelties that call themselves math. B. Enizuru's brows lifted the width of a thread. You'll have to do better than math as an insult. She glanced at Kojiro. And you're not arresting me. No, he said. Kumo is. Yugito had not put the blue away entirely. It glimmered along her knuckles in a line like a note. Procedure, she said, all business. Choir Director Benizuru, you're detained on the authority of the Joint Council on Air SP. Ace Ethics for unauthorized deployment of hazardous null infrastructure over inhabited terrain, pending review. We'll keep it tidy. Benizuru watched her with the alert boredom of a woman more annoyed at logistics than at being caught. Then she set her case down and held out her wrists as if to a tailor. Of course, she said. If the board is seated by morning. Yugito's mouth twitched. We were doing that anyway. Kojiro nodded once, firm, like a book closing in the right place. I'll start a reparations unit, he said to no one in particular, which is how you say yes to yourself. We'll make the engine right. Or bury it deep, Shion said. Deep, he agreed. The night calmed. The hole in the cloud roof mended itself with slow stitches. People swept glass. Choir operatives Riko, figured into a cordon that looked like civic utility. Kumo's captain started the business of counting damages and discussed. Naruto leaned against the terrace rail until his ribs argued. He straightened. Because someone else needed it more than he needed sympathy. Hinata stood quietly next to him and took his hand. The whole thing, not the wrist, not the edge, fingers interlacing like two choices that had decided on the same sentence. He looked at her and didn't try to make it cinematic. I want to be with you, he said. Not because of prophecies or roofs. Because you make me brave in the right direction. Her eyes softened. That luminous steadiness that had unstitched panic in him quietly for months. Then be with me, she said. We can practice being small together when the world isn't. He laughed because the line was so exactly her, and because relief makes your ribs do strange things. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. It wasn't a vow on a bell. It was better. Two people you. Sing plain language and meaning every word. Morning in Kumo smells like clean stone and tea that's been steeped with a view. The council convened under bright, honest light. Paper began doing its slow miracle. The airspace accord wasn't pretty. It had margins that would get coffee on them and clauses that would make lawyers argue. It had one stubborn sentence she implanted like a flag, no engine O. Our edict shall be enacted over a community without the community's consent. Kojiro added a rider about reparations that would make accountants sweat and sleep well. Yugito wrote a line about bell towers. Benizuru corrected the punctuation with a sigh, which somehow made it feel more real. Naruto didn't sign because that's not how it works. He watched it exist. He watched a village act like a village. At noon, with paperwork done to the point where someone else could keep doing it, Team 7 and the people who had become their orbit walked the high parapet where wind snatched words and threw them laughing into the next valley. Tamari claimed the upwind spot because that's who she was. Karen announced she would sleep for a week and then immediately began scheduling everyone else's naps. Shio N stood apart and let the view write a cleaner line in the inside of her head. Yugito leaned back on her elbows and studied the sky like a cat listening to a ceiling. He'll try again, she said. In the open. Naruto nodded. Not as performance, just truth. Then we meet him there, he said. Where choices can't be forced to be small. Bring a bigger roof, Tamari said. The square almost wasn't enough. We will, he said. And meant we in the large. They left Kumo with fresh ink on policy and old dust in their boots. Kojiro walked them to the gate, hands where everyone could see them, ring nowhere near anyone's nerves. He gave Naruto a slim cylinder of paper, sealed with the neatness of a man who expects you to appreciate neatness. What's this? Naruto asked. Maps, Kojiro said. We've been tagging currents, where the world listens wrong. Call them loads if you like. I don't. His gaze softened, just for a second. If you're going to make a roof, you'll need pillars. We'll build community centers on them. Naruto said solemnly. Kojiro almost smiled. Try temples, he said. More funding. They exchanged a glance that had more respect in it than anyone was going to admit out loud. Benizuru, confined to a tidy room with a view and 3 guards who had learned the art of polite boredom, watched from a window and made a note that read less like surrender and more like a plan that would finally include other people. The road home curled along a river that refused to hurry. Naruto walked at a pace Hinata liked, which turned out to be slower than he would choose alone and faster than most people would expect. He did not test open sky, he let his feet be feet. Sanctuary rode within his breath like a new habit trying on its first day. Do you ever get tired of being a king? Karen asked as a joke. I'm not, he said. I'm a guy with a rule. You're a king when people choose to stand under it, Shion said, dropping a stone into the river and watching circles widen. That's the only kind that doesn't rot. Tamari side-eyed him with affection she would strenuously deny. Try not to get smug, she said. Smug looks bad with scales. He grinned. If I do, hit me with your fan. She smirked. You couldn't pay me enough to pass that up. Konoha smelled like damp earth and second chances. The tower with bad tiles waited. Iruka was where he always managed to be, pretending coincidence and fooling nobody. He looked at Naruto's face and did that thing where his mouth twitched when he was choosing whether to scold or to feed. He fed him. Night found him on his roof with Kojiro's map unrolled against the parapet. Ink dots marked places the wind had learned to listen wrong. A scatter across the coastlines, a wedge near a mountain pass he dreamed of as a kid, a clues. Tear around a lake everyone said haunted because it refused to freeze. Where do we go first? Hinata asked, head near his shoulder, careful of the map. Where the roof leaks worst, he said, and it sounded like a joke until it didn't. They picked 3 dots and circled them. He didn't feel like a god. He felt like a carpenter with a beautiful, infuriating job. He tucked the map away, ran a thumb up, gently along the place his scales had cracked and firmed, and lay back. The sky over Konoha looked like it always had. Somewhere in it was a seam a man had learned to walk through, somewhere else a shrine bell hummed a small, satisfied chord. Somewhere a sea trench rolled, unhappy. Somewhere a woman in a tidy room edited a policy draft to add a clause about sunset deployments and wrote a note to a friend that said simply, help me do this right. Naruto squeezed Hinata's hand and felt her squeeze back. The city breathed. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be work. Good. He had people. He had a rule. He had a roof to build under a sky he refused to own. Chapter 5 End.